The rope around Charlotte Hale's wrists cut into her skin, but she no longer felt it. She only felt the cold morning air on her face and the thousands of eyes watching her from below the platform. The square was packed with people who had once bowed to her, people who had once smiled at her, and now they only watched in silence, waiting for the moment her life would end. She lifted her chin and looked for him. Duke Edmund Cole stood above the crowd on the balcony of the old stone courthouse, dressed in deep blue and silver, his face carved from ice. He did not look away from her. He did not look ashamed. He simply watched, the way a man watches rain fall on a window, distant and unmoved. "Edmund," she whispered, though she knew he could not hear her from that distance. "Look at me. Tell me you know I am innocent." He said nothing. He gave no sign. The silence between them was louder than the crowd. 3 days earlier, Charlotte had been the woman closest to him in the entire kingdom. She had been his advisor, his confidant, the one person who read his letters before his own ministers did. She had loved him quietly for 2 years, never speaking the words aloud because she believed a duke did not marry a merchant's daughter, no matter how clever she was. Then the accusation came. Someone had planted stolen documents in her chambers, papers that named her as the one who had been selling the kingdom's trade routes to a rival province. She had never seen those papers before the guards found them. She had begged Edmund to believe her, to give her time to prove her innocence. He had looked at her the way he looked at her now, cold and unreadable, and ordered her arrest. The executioner stepped forward. Charlotte closed her eyes and thought of her father, of the small house by the harbor, where she had grown up counting coins for his shipping business, of the years she had spent studying late into the night, so she could one day stand beside a man she believed was worth trusting. She had been wrong. The blade fell, and the world went dark. When Charlotte opened her eyes again, she was staring at a ceiling she had not seen in years. Soft morning light came through pale yellow curtains. A bird sang somewhere outside the window. Her hands were shaking as she lifted them in front of her face. They were smaller than she remembered, unmarked. No rope burns, no scars. She sat up too fast and nearly fell from the bed. Her room, her old room, in her father's house by the harbor, with the same crooked shelf holding the same wooden ships he had carved for her when she was a child. "This cannot be real," she said aloud, her voice trembling. A knock came at the door, and a familiar voice called through it. "Charlotte, are you awake? Your father wants you downstairs before the merchants arrive." It was Molly, the maid who had worked for her family since Charlotte was a little girl. Molly who had died of a fever 4 years ago, in the life Charlotte remembered, the life that had ended on a platform with a blade and a crowd of silent strangers. Charlotte pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. She rose from the bed and walked to the small mirror on the wall. The face that looked back at her was her own, but younger, 16 years old perhaps. 3 years before she would ever set foot in the palace. 3 years before she would ever meet Duke Edmund Cole. She had been given a second life. For a long moment, Charlotte simply stood there, staring at her own reflection, trying to understand what had happened to her. She remembered everything. The years at court, the friendships that turned to betrayal, the documents that were never hers, the execution, the crowd, his face. All of it lived inside her mind, as clearly as if it had happened yesterday, and yet here she was, standing in a body that had not yet lived through any of it. She thought of her father's warm laugh, the one she had not heard in years because grief had worn it thin by the time she died. She thought of the friends she had trusted at court, who had turned their backs on her the moment the accusations began. She thought of Edmund and how easily he had believed the worst of her, how easily he had let her die without asking a single question. This time would be different, she told herself. She would not walk blindly into that palace. She would not give her heart to a man who would not fight for her. She would build something of her own, something no one could take from her with a forged letter and a cold command. Downstairs, her father, Whitmore Hale, was going over shipping ledgers at the long wooden table, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his gray hair uncombed as it always was in the early morning. He looked up when Charlotte entered, and the sight of him, alive and unburdened by the grief that had aged him in her first life, nearly brought her to tears again. "You look pale," he said, setting down his pen. "Did you sleep poorly?" "I had a strange dream," Charlotte said carefully. "That is all." She sat across from him and studied the ledgers upside down. numbers she had once known by heart. In her first life, she had left this house at 17 to take a position at the palace, recommended by a family friend, who said her sharp mind was wasted counting coins. She remembered how proud her father had been, how he had wept a little at the door when she left, not knowing it would lead her to a blade 3 years later. "Father," she said slowly, "what would you think if I did not go to the palace this year? What if I stayed and learned the shipping business properly instead?" Whitmore raised his eyebrows in surprise. "You have spoken of nothing else since you were 12 years old. What has changed?" Charlotte chose her words with care, the way she had learned to choose them in a life full of careful words that had still failed to save her. "I think there is more to learn in the world than what happens inside a palace. I want to understand how you build something that lasts. I want to understand people who earn their place, instead of being born into it." Her father studied her for a long moment, and then a slow smile spread across his face, one she remembered fondly, one she had missed for years without knowing it. "Then I will teach you everything I know," he said. "Though I warn you, it is far less glamorous than silk gowns and palace balls." "I do not need glamour," Charlotte said. "I need to understand how the world truly works." Over the following weeks, Charlotte threw herself into her father's business, with a hunger that surprised even her. She had once been quick with numbers as a girl, but now she brought the sharpened instincts of a woman who had survived court politics, who had learned to read a lie in someone's eyes before they finished speaking it. She noticed patterns in the ledgers that her father's clerks had missed for years, small discrepancies in payments to a warehouse manager who had been quietly taking profits that were not his. She uncovered it within a month, calmly and without drama, simply by asking the right questions at the right time. Her father was astonished. "Where did you learn to see such things?" "I paid attention," Charlotte said simply, unwilling to explain that she had learned it the hard way, watching corrupt officials hide their crimes behind polite smiles in a palace that no longer existed for her in this life, at least not yet. She began meeting with other merchant families in the city, not as a young woman looking for a husband, but as someone genuinely curious about trade routes, about contracts, about the quiet networks of influence that move through the city like unseen rivers. Among them was a young merchant named Henry Baxter, the son of a spice trader, who was known for his fairness in dealings and his refusal to offer secret favors to officials the way many of his rivals did. "You ask more questions than any young lady I have met," Henry said to her one afternoon, as they walked along the docks, discussing a shipment of dyed cloth. "Most are more interested in which lord is unmarried this season." "I find lords rather uninteresting," Charlotte said, and meant it more than he could have known. Henry laughed, a warm and easy sound. "Then you will fit strangely well among the merchants, Miss Hale. We are a plain sort of people. We care more for a fair contract than a fine title." Charlotte found herself smiling, truly smiling, for the first time since she had woken in this new life. There was something steadying about Henry's honesty, something that reminded her that not everyone in the world was like the court she remembered, full of smiles that hid daggers. But even as she built her quiet life among the merchants and her father's ledgers, Charlotte could not fully escape the shadow of what she knew was coming. She remembered the names of the officials who would one day frame her. She remembered the exact season the accusations had first begun to spread, a slow poison dropped into the ears of powerful men until it became impossible to trace its origin. She remembered a steward named Gareth Price, a quiet, unremarkable man who served in Duke Cole's household, and who she now suspected, upon reflection with clearer eyes, had been the one who placed the false documents in her chambers. She had never thought to question him in her first life. He had always seemed loyal, forgettable, the sort of man who blended into the walls of every room he entered. But blending into walls was exactly what a man needed to do if he wished to commit betrayal without anyone noticing. Charlotte began, carefully and quietly, to gather information about Gareth Price. She asked Henry, whose family did business with several noble households, what he knew of the Duke's staff. "Price," Henry said thoughtfully, over tea one evening at her father's house. "I have heard the name. He handles much of the Duke's private correspondence, I believe. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Charlotte said. "I heard it mentioned somewhere, and wondered." Henry gave her a curious look, but did not press further, and Charlotte was grateful for it. She was not yet ready to explain the truth to anyone. not even to a friend as trustworthy as Henry seemed to be. She had learned, in her first life, that trust given too freely was often the very thing that destroyed a person. Still, the name Gareth Price sat in her mind like a splinter she could not remove. If he had been the one to frame her before, it meant he was working for someone, or something, larger than himself. A single steward did not simply decide to destroy a young advisor's reputation without reason or reward. Someone had wanted her gone. Someone had wanted access to whatever position she would eventually hold within the Duke's trust. And if that plot was already forming somewhere in the shadows of the ducal household, even now, 3 years before she would ever step foot in that world, then perhaps this time she could stop it before it ever had the chance to reach her. Charlotte began writing letters, careful and vague, to distant contacts of her father's, who worked in trade with the northern provinces, asking small questions about unusual shifts in trade agreements, about which officials seemed unusually wealthy for their positions. She did this slowly, patiently, never asking anything that might draw suspicion, building a quiet web of information, the way a spider builds a web, one careful thread at a time. Meanwhile, her father's business flourished under her sharpened attention, and whispers began to spread through the merchant quarter of the clever young woman who had uncovered wrongdoing in her own household, and who asked questions no one else thought to ask. She did not seek this reputation. She did not want attention, but attention found her regardless, the way it always seemed to find people who were different from those around them. One evening, as autumn settled over the harbor city, and the air grew crisp with the smell of salt and coming rain, Charlotte stood at her window and looked out over the water, remembering the platform, the crowd, the blade, and the cold face of the man who had let her die without a single word in her defense. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and made herself a quiet promise. She would not become the woman who knelt and begged for mercy. She would become the woman who never needed to. And if fate, in its strange and unpredictable design, brought her back into the path of Duke Edmund Cole, she would not walk toward him blind and trusting as she once had. This time, if their paths crossed again, he would learn what it meant to lose someone he once dismissed so easily. This time, she would be the one standing above him when the truth finally came to light. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall against the window, and somewhere across the city, in a palace Charlotte had not yet entered in this new life, a quiet and unremarkable steward named Gareth Price sat at his desk, already beginning to weave the same web of lies that had once cost her everything. But this time, she was watching. Henry noticed the change in her within a matter of weeks. Charlotte no longer spoke like a young woman waiting for her life to begin. She spoke like someone already carrying the weight of decisions yet to be made. One afternoon, as they reviewed a contract together at her father's table, he set down his pen and studied her carefully. "You ask about the ducal household more than any merchant's daughter I have ever known," he said. "Is there something you are not telling me, Charlotte?" She hesitated, weighing how much truth she could afford to share. "I have a feeling," she said finally, "that something is wrong within that household. Something that will cause harm if no one notices it in time." "A feeling," Henry repeated, not quite believing her, though he did not dismiss her either. He had learned, in the short months of knowing her, that Charlotte's feelings had an uncomfortable habit of proving correct. "What sort of harm?" "I cannot say for certain yet," Charlotte admitted, "but I intend to find out before it grows any larger." Henry leaned back in his chair, studying her with new curiosity. "You realize that the Duke's household is not something ordinary merchants concern themselves with. If you go looking for trouble in that direction, you may find far more than you expect." "I know," Charlotte said quietly. "I have thought about little else." That night, after Henry had gone home, Charlotte sat alone in her room, with a single candle burning low on her desk. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing down everything she remembered from her first life, every name, every date, every small detail that might one day matter. She wrote of the trade agreements that had gone missing before the accusations began. She wrote of the quiet meetings she had once witnessed between officials she had trusted, meetings she had not thought twice about at the time. She wrote of Gareth Price, and how he always seemed to be near whenever something important was being decided, never speaking, only listening. She folded the paper carefully and hid it inside a small wooden box beneath her floorboards, a hiding place she had used as a child to keep her treasures safe from prying eyes. This time, her treasure was not a trinket, or a letter from a friend. It was knowledge, the one thing that had been taken from her too late in her first life. She would not make that mistake again. As she blew out the candle and lay down to sleep, Charlotte thought of Edmund Cole, not the cold and distant man who had watched her execution without flinching, but the boy he must still be somewhere in this timeline, not yet the Duke, not yet hardened by whatever had shaped him into the man who could order her death without a second thought. She wondered, briefly, what had made him that way. She wondered if there was still time to understand it, or if some things were simply broken beyond repair. But that thought quickly hardened into something colder and more useful. She did not need to understand him. She needed to survive him, and this time, she intended to make certain that whatever happened between them, she would never again be the one who knelt while he stood untouched above her. Somewhere across the city, behind the high walls of the ducal estate, a boy of 19 sat alone in a cold study, listening to his father's harsh voice through the door, learning lessons about power and control that would one day shape the man Charlotte had once loved and lost. He did not know her name yet. He did not know that her fate and his were already tangled together in ways neither of them could see. But 3 years was not so long a time, and fate, it seemed, had a habit of finding its way back to where it began. 2 years passed, and the harbor city grew louder, with talk of Charlotte Hale, before she had even set foot near the palace gates. She was 18 now, and the girl who had once been content to help her father count coins had become something far sharper. A young woman, who merchants sought out for advice on contracts, who officials quietly consulted when they wished to avoid a costly mistake. She never asked for the attention, but she had learned that reputation, once earned honestly, could become a shield stronger than any title. It was on a gray afternoon, while she was reviewing a shipment manifest at the harbor warehouse, that a finely dressed woman stepped through the doors, trailed by 2 attendants who looked deeply uncomfortable among the smell of tar and salted fish. The woman wore silk, the color of deep plum, and her eyes moved across the warehouse with the practiced disdain of someone who rarely left the palace grounds. "I am looking for Charlotte Hale," the woman said, her voice smooth and clipped. Charlotte set down her ledger and rose. "You have found her." The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly, as though she had expected someone older, someone less plainly dressed.
"My name is Vivian Ashcombe. I serve as a companion to the Duchess Agatha Cole. I have heard your name mentioned more than once in recent months, always in connection with clever business dealings and an unusually sharp eye for fraud."
Charlotte kept her expression carefully neutral, though inside, her mind raced. Vivian Ashcombe. In her first life, Charlotte remembered the name only vaguely, a court lady who had smiled at her sweetly during feasts and then vanished from memory the moment the accusations began, never once speaking in her defense. She had not thought much of Vivian before. Now, meeting her again with fresh eyes, Charlotte studied every small detail, the careful way Vivian's gaze lingered on the warehouse ledgers, the practiced ease with which she delivered flattering words that felt just slightly too rehearsed. "I am flattered that my small work has reached the palace," Charlotte said evenly. "Though I confess, I am curious why it would interest the Duchess's companion." Vivian smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "The Duchess has taken an interest in strengthening trade agreements with the merchant houses. She believes fresh voices, ones not tangled in old court rivalries, might see solutions that old advisors have missed. She wondered if you might be willing to offer your opinion on a certain matter, informally, of course." Charlotte felt the familiar tug of danger beneath the polite words. This was how it had begun before, she remembered now. A small invitation, a flattering request. A door opened just wide enough to draw her in before she understood what waited on the other side. But this time, she was not the same trusting girl who had walked through that door without question. "I would be glad to offer my thoughts," Charlotte said carefully, "though I must ask what matter concerns the Duchess so directly that she would send her companion to a harbor warehouse, rather than summon a merchant to the palace, as custom would suggest." Vivian's smile flickered, just barely, before smoothing back into place. "You are as sharp as they say. Very well. There have been irregularities in certain trade agreements along the northern route. Some officials suspect sabotage from a rival province. Others suspect the fault lies closer to home, within the Duke's own household. The Duchess wishes for an outside opinion, someone with no loyalty to either side, to review the matter quietly before it becomes a public scandal." Charlotte's pulse quickened, though she kept her face calm. The northern trade route. The very thing she remembered being blamed for in her first life. The very documents that had been planted in her chambers as false proof of her betrayal. It seemed the conspiracy she remembered was already beginning to take shape, years earlier than she had expected, and now, through Vivian Ashcombe, it was reaching toward her once again, as though fate itself was determined to pull her back into the same trap. She considered refusing outright, staying far from anything connected to the ducal household, but she remembered, too, the cost of ignorance in her first life, how she had walked blindly into danger because she had not understood the forces working against her, until it was too late. If the conspiracy was already forming, perhaps the wisest path was not to run from it, but to walk toward it carefully, with her eyes fully open this time. "I would need to see the records myself," Charlotte said. "I do not offer opinions on matters I cannot examine directly." "Naturally," Vivian said. "I will arrange for copies to be sent to you within the week. Discreetly, of course. The Duchess does not wish for this matter to become common gossip before the truth is known." After Vivian left, Charlotte stood alone in the warehouse for a long while, staring at the door through which the woman had disappeared. She thought of her father's warning from years ago, gentle but firm, that the world beyond the harbor was full of currents that could pull even the strongest swimmer under if she was not careful. She thought of Henry, who had told her that the ducal household was not something ordinary merchants concerned themselves with. But Charlotte was no longer an ordinary merchant's daughter, content to stay safely on the shore. She had died once already, at the hands of that household's cruelty. She would not spend this second life hiding from it. When Henry arrived later that evening for their usual review of accounts, Charlotte told him everything Vivian had said, watching his expression shift from curiosity to concern. "This is precisely the sort of trouble I warned you about," Henry said, setting down his cup of tea untouched. "If there truly is a conspiracy forming within the Duke's household, involving you in it, even informally, could paint a target on your back that you cannot easily remove." "I know the risk," Charlotte said quietly, "but I believe this conspiracy already exists, whether I involve myself or not. If I stay away, I will simply be blind to what is coming. And blindness, Henry, is far more dangerous than knowledge, no matter how frightening that knowledge might be." Henry studied her for a long moment, clearly wanting to argue further, but something in her steady gaze convinced him that her mind was already made. "Then I will help you however I can," he said finally, "though I hope you know what you are stepping into." "I know exactly what I am stepping into," Charlotte said, and for the first time since Vivian Ashcombe had walked through the warehouse doors, a small, sharp feeling rose in her chest. Something close to purpose, something close to the quiet satisfaction of finally standing on solid ground, instead of waiting helplessly for the ground to give way beneath her feet. That night, as she once again took out her hidden notes from beneath the floorboards, Charlotte added a new name to her careful records. Vivian Ashcombe. A companion to the Duchess, sent to test the waters, sent to see whether Charlotte Hale might be drawn into the same trap that had once cost her everything. Whoever was orchestrating this conspiracy, whether it was Gareth Price acting alone or a larger hand working through him, they had made their first move without realizing that this time their intended victim was watching every step with clear and unclouded eyes. Somewhere within the walls of the ducal estate, a young man now 21 years old sat across from his father, the aging Duke Cole, listening to a lecture about strength and weakness, about how a ruler could never afford to trust too easily, how mercy was a luxury only the powerless could afford. Edmund had heard this lecture many times before, and each time, something inside him grew a little colder, a little more convinced that his father's cold philosophy was simply the price of holding power in a world that rewarded suspicion over trust. He did not yet know the name Charlotte Hale. He did not yet know that a woman from the harbor district was, at that very moment, uncovering the first threads of a conspiracy that would one day reach into his own household, threatening everything his family had built. But threads, once pulled, rarely stayed hidden for long, and somewhere in the space between the harbor and the palace, two paths that had once collided in tragedy were slowly, carefully, beginning to draw close once again. The records arrived 5 days later, delivered not by a palace courier in official colors, but by a quiet young man in plain clothes, who said nothing beyond confirming her name, before handing over a sealed leather folder and disappearing back into the crowded street. Charlotte waited until she was alone in her room before breaking the seal, her hands steady, despite the quickened beat of her heart. Inside were copies of trade agreements from the past 2 years, shipping manifests, tax records, and letters between officials discussing the northern route. She spread them across her desk and began reading with the same careful attention she had once given to her father's ledgers, searching for the small inconsistencies that most eyes would overlook. It did not take long to find them. A shipment of grain recorded as sold to a northern buyer at a price far below what the market demanded, with no clear explanation for the loss. A separate letter referencing a private agreement that did not appear anywhere in the official contracts. And scattered throughout, in the careful, unremarkable handwriting she recognized instantly, from a signature she had once seen countless times without understanding its danger, the initials of Gareth Price, present at nearly every meeting where these strange decisions had been made. Charlotte sat back in her chair, her pulse quickening. It was exactly as she remembered, the same pattern of hidden losses and quiet meetings that had eventually been twisted into evidence against her. Except this time, the pattern was still forming. This time, she was seeing it take shape from the very beginning, rather than discovering it only after it had already destroyed her. She spent the following days poring over every document Vivian had sent, cross-referencing dates and names against the notes she had hidden beneath her floorboards. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. Gareth Price was not acting alone. Someone above him, someone with far greater influence within the ducal household, was allowing these losses to continue, perhaps even directing them, using the northern trade route as a means of quietly draining wealth from the Duke's own treasury, while making it appear as ordinary market misfortune. But who would benefit from weakening the Duke's own finances so carefully, so patiently, over the course of years? Charlotte considered the question late into the night, turning over every name she could remember from her first life, searching for someone with reason to see the ducal household grow weak from within. It was on the 6th night, as she cross-referenced a particular shipment date against a letter mentioning a private meeting at a countryside estate, that she heard the creak of a floorboard outside her bedroom door. She froze, her hand still resting on the scattered papers across her desk. The sound came again, closer this time, deliberate rather than accidental. Charlotte moved quickly, gathering the documents into their folder and sliding them beneath a loose panel in her wardrobe, a hiding place she had prepared in advance for exactly this possibility. She had barely closed the panel when the door opened without a knock, and her father stepped inside, his face drawn with concern. "Charlotte," Whitmore said, his voice low, "there is a man downstairs asking after you. He says he serves the Duchess coal, but something about him makes me uneasy. I do not like the way he looks around a room, as though counting every object within it." Charlotte felt a cold chill settle over her. She descended the stairs a few minutes later, composing her expression into calm curiosity, to find a thin, unremarkable man standing near the front door, his gaze indeed moving carefully across the room, cataloging every detail with quiet precision. She recognized him instantly, though she had only ever seen him from a distance in her first life. Gareth Price. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice soft and carefully polite. "I apologize for the late hour. I was sent to confirm that the documents reached you safely, and to remind you of the Duchess's wish for discretion in this matter." "They arrived without issue," Charlotte said evenly, giving nothing away in her tone or expression. "I have been reviewing them carefully." "Good," Price said, his eyes lingering on her a moment too long. "The Duchess values discretion above all else. I trust you understand the sensitivity of what you have been given." "I understand it completely," Charlotte said, holding his gaze without flinching, though inside her chest, her heart pounded against her ribs. This was the man who, in another life, had helped destroy everything she had built. This was the man who had likely planted false evidence in her chambers, who had watched with quiet satisfaction as she was dragged away in chains for crimes she never committed. Price studied her for a moment longer, as though searching for something beneath her calm expression, some sign of fear or hesitation he could use against her. Finding none, he offered a thin smile and took his leave, disappearing into the dark street without another word. Charlotte closed the door behind him and stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly to steady herself. Her father approached cautiously from the sitting room, his brow still furrowed with worry. "You know that man," he said. It was not a question. "I know of him." Charlotte said carefully, "and I do not trust him." "Then perhaps it is time to tell me exactly what you have gotten yourself into," Whitmore said, his voice firm in a way she rarely heard from him. "I have watched you grow more distant and more careful these past months, Charlotte, and I have said nothing because I trusted your judgment. But I will not stand by while you walk into danger without understanding it." Charlotte looked at her father, this good and honest man who had raised her with nothing but kindness, and she felt the familiar ache of wanting to protect him from the truth, the same instinct that had once kept her silent, even as the walls closed in around her in her first life. But silence, she reminded herself, had not saved her before. Perhaps honesty, carefully measured, would serve her better this time. "There are people within the Duke's household," she said slowly, "who are stealing from his own treasury, hiding their crimes behind ordinary trade losses. I believe they intend to use this scheme to weaken the Duke's position, perhaps even to shift blame onto someone else entirely, if the truth ever comes to light. I intend to understand exactly who is behind it before that happens." Her father was silent for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "And why?" he asked finally. "Does my daughter feel such a fierce need to prevent harm to a duke she has never even met?" Charlotte hesitated, unable to explain the truth of her first life, without sounding as though she had lost her senses entirely. "Because," she said instead, choosing the closest truth she could offer, "I have seen what happens when the innocent are blamed for the crimes of the guilty, and I could not live with myself if I had the chance to prevent it, and did nothing." Whitmore studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. "Then be careful," he said. "Men like the one who just left this house do not forgive those who see through them." Charlotte returned to her room that night with her father's warning echoing in her mind, and as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she understood, with a clarity that settled deep in her bones, that the quiet, careful path she had been walking was about to lead her somewhere she could no longer avoid. Somewhere close to the very household that had once ended her life. Somewhere close to the man whose cold, unmoved face still haunted the edges of her memory. The threads Vivian Ashcombe had handed her, whether by accident or design, were pulling Charlotte inevitably toward the palace gates, toward the world she had once sworn to approach only with open eyes. And she could feel, with the same instinct that had once warned her of danger too late, that the moment she finally crossed those gates and stood once again in the same room as Duke Edmund Cole, nothing about this second life would remain simple ever again. The summons came on a bright morning, nearly 3 weeks after Gareth Price had stood uninvited in her father's front hall. A palace courier, this one dressed in proper ducal colors, arrived at the harbor house with a formal letter bearing the Duchess's seal, requesting Charlotte's presence at the palace to present her findings on the northern trade irregularities. Charlotte read the letter twice, feeling the strange, dizzying sensation of standing at the edge of a door she had once walked through blindly, now walking through it again, with her eyes fully open. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple gown of deep green rather than anything overly fine, wanting to present herself as exactly what she was, a merchant's daughter, with sharp eyes and sound judgment, not someone seeking to climb above her station. Henry offered to accompany her as far as the palace gates, though he could go no further without an invitation of his own. "Remember," he said, as their carriage rattled toward the palace grounds, "you owe nothing to anyone within those walls. If something feels wrong, you may simply leave." "I know," Charlotte said, though she also knew, deep down, that leaving would not be quite so simple once she stepped inside. The palace looked exactly as she remembered it. Tall spires of pale stone, rising against the morning sky, wide gardens kept in perfect order, guards standing at attention along every entrance. She had once found this place beautiful, even magical, the first time she had walked through its gates as a hopeful young advisor. Now she saw it differently, saw the careful architecture of power behind every graceful arch, the way beauty here was simply another tool, used to remind visitors of their place. Vivian Ashcombe met her at the entrance, dressed once again in fine silk, her expression polite but distant. "The Duchess is eager to hear your findings," Vivian said as she led Charlotte through a series of long corridors. "Though I should warn you, the Duke himself has taken an interest in this matter as well. He will be present during your presentation." Charlotte's step did not falter, though something inside her chest tightened at the words. She had known, of course, that this moment would eventually come, that fate seemed determined to place her once again in the same room as the man who had ordered her death without hesitation. She had told herself for years that she was prepared for it. Now, walking toward that meeting, she was no longer entirely certain. They entered a private council chamber, smaller than the grand halls Charlotte remembered from feasts and ceremonies, furnished simply with a long table and tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens. Duchess Agatha Cole sat at the head of the table, an elegant woman in her middle years, with sharp, observant eyes that reminded Charlotte faintly of her son, though softened by something warmer that Edmund himself seemed to lack. Beside the Duchess sat an older advisor Charlotte did not recognize, and standing near the window, arms crossed, dressed in the deep blue and silver of his household, was Duke Edmund Cole. He looked younger than the man Charlotte remembered from the platform, only 21 now, though the same coldness already lived in his eyes, the same careful, guarded distance that had once made him impossible to read, even after 2 years of working closely beside him. He glanced at her as she entered, his expression unreadable, giving no indication of recognition, no indication of anything at all beyond mild curiosity at the arrival of an unfamiliar merchant's daughter. Of course he did not recognize her. In this life, they had never met. "Miss Hale," Duchess Agatha said warmly, gesturing to a chair across the table. "Thank you for coming. Vivian tells me you have made remarkable progress reviewing the Northern trade records." "I have found several irregularities, Your Grace," Charlotte said, seating herself with practiced composure, though her pulse still beat unevenly beneath her calm exterior. "Patterns that suggest the losses are not simply the result of market misfortune." "Go on," the Duchess said, folding her hands atop the table. Charlotte laid out her findings carefully, describing the underpriced grain shipments, the private agreements that appeared nowhere in official contracts, the recurring presence of a particular official's signature at nearly every questionable transaction. She chose her words with precision, careful not to name Gareth Price outright just yet, wanting first to understand how much the Duchess already suspected. Throughout her presentation, Edmund said nothing, though Charlotte was acutely aware of his gaze resting on her, studying her the way a man studies an unfamiliar puzzle, searching for the trick hidden within it. When she finally finished, he was the one who spoke first. "You speak with a great deal of certainty for someone who has only had these records for a matter of weeks," he said, his voice cool and measured. "Forgive me if I find it curious that a merchant's daughter with no formal training in finance or law has uncovered what our own advisors failed to notice for years." Charlotte met his gaze evenly, refusing to let the old, familiar coldness in his eyes unsettle her the way it once might have. "Perhaps, Your Grace," she said, "your advisors were too close to the pattern to see it clearly. Sometimes a fresh eye notices what a familiar one has learned to overlook." Something flickered briefly across Edmund's expression. Not quite surprise, but something close to it, as though he had not expected such a direct response from someone he clearly viewed as beneath his notice. "And what pattern, precisely, do you believe you have found?" "Theft," Charlotte said simply, "carefully disguised as misfortune, carried out over several years by someone with regular access to your household's private dealings. I believe whoever is responsible intends for these losses to continue quietly, weakening your treasury without ever drawing suspicion directly to themselves." The room fell silent. The older advisor beside the Duchess shifted uncomfortably in his seat, though he said nothing. Duchess Agatha's expression grew serious, all trace of polite warmth fading into something far more focused. "You believe someone within my own household is responsible," the Duchess said quietly. "I believe it is likely, Your Grace," Charlotte said, "though I do not yet have proof strong enough to name a specific individual with certainty." Edmund studied her for a long moment, his arms still crossed, his expression unreadable in the way she remembered so painfully well. "And if you did have such proof," he said slowly, "what would you have us do with it?" Charlotte held his gaze, feeling the old ache rise briefly in her chest before she pushed it firmly aside. "I would hope, Your Grace, that whoever holds power over such proof would examine it fully and fairly, rather than rushing to judgment before the truth is entirely understood." She had not meant the words as anything more than practical advice, yet the moment they left her lips, she saw something shift in Edmund's expression, a flicker of something almost like unease, as though her words had struck closer to a private nerve than she could have known. He said nothing further, though his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary before he turned back toward the window. The Duchess broke the silence, her tone brisk and businesslike once more. "Continue your investigation, Miss Hale. I will ensure you have access to whatever additional records you require. This matter must be resolved quietly and completely before it grows into something beyond our control." "Of course, Your Grace," Charlotte said, rising as the meeting drew to its close. As she gathered her things to leave, Edmund finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time, meant only for her. "You are certain of yourself, Miss Hale, for someone stepping into matters far above her station." Charlotte turned to face him fully, refusing to let the old instinct to shrink beneath his gaze take hold of her again. "I have learned, Your Grace," she said evenly, "that certainty is often simply the result of paying close attention, something I intend to continue doing throughout this matter." For a brief moment, something almost like respect flickered across his cold expression before he masked it once more behind careful indifference. "Then I look forward to seeing what your attention uncovers," he said, and turned away, without another word. Charlotte left the palace that afternoon, with her mind racing, replaying every moment of the meeting, every flicker of expression that had crossed Edmund's face. He was different from the man she remembered in small, unexpected ways, less openly cruel, more guarded than cold, as though the harshness she remembered had not yet fully hardened into place. It gave her an uncomfortable thought she had not expected to have, a thought she quickly pushed aside as foolish and dangerous. It did not matter what he had once been, or what he might yet become. What mattered was the conspiracy quietly unraveling beneath the surface of his household, a conspiracy that had once cost her everything, and that she now intended to expose fully before it had the chance to claim another innocent life. As her carriage rolled back toward the harbor district, Charlotte glanced back once at the palace spires rising behind her, and felt, with a certainty she could not quite explain, that she had just taken the first true step back into the world that had once destroyed her. This time, however, she was not walking in blindly. This time, she carried knowledge instead of trust, caution instead of hope, and somewhere deep within her, a quiet resolve that no matter what came next, she would not kneel before that platform again. Henry was waiting for her outside the palace gates exactly as he had promised, pacing near the carriage with visible relief when he saw her emerge unharmed. "Well?" he asked, helping her into the carriage. "How did it go?" "Better than I expected, and worse," Charlotte said, settling into her seat as the carriage began to move. "The Duchess wishes for me to continue the investigation, but the Duke was present, and he questioned everything I said." Henry's brow furrowed with concern. "The Duke himself questioned you directly?" "He is suspicious of easy answers," Charlotte said carefully. "Which, I suppose, is not entirely unwise of him." She did not tell Henry how strange it had felt to stand in the same room as Edmund Cole again, to hear his voice address her without any trace of the warmth she remembered from years she had not yet lived in this timeline. She did not tell him how unsettling it was to notice, despite everything, that some small part of her still searched his face for the man she had once trusted completely. As the carriage rolled through the busy streets of the capital, Charlotte's thoughts turned back to the council chamber, replaying every detail of the meeting. The older advisor who had sat beside the Duchess, silent and uneasy throughout the entire presentation, troubled her more than she had let on. She did not yet know his name, but something about his discomfort suggested he knew more than he was willing to say in front of the Duke and Duchess. "Henry," she said slowly, "do you know the name of an older advisor who serves the Duchess directly?" Gray-haired, thin, seemed nervous throughout most of the meeting. Henry considered this for a moment. That could be several men, but if he sits close to the Duchess during private council matters, it is likely Colin Marsh. He has served the family for many years, long enough to remember the old Duke's rule, before Edmund's father passed the title down. "Why do you ask?" "He seemed uneasy," Charlotte said, "as though my findings touched on something he already suspected, or perhaps something he already knew." "Then perhaps," Henry said thoughtfully, "he is a man worth speaking with directly, away from the ears of the Duchess and her companion." Charlotte turned this idea over carefully in her mind. Approaching Colin Marsh directly carried risk, especially if he was somehow connected to the very corruption she was investigating. But her instincts, the same instincts that had once failed her fatally, but had grown far sharper since her second chance began, told her that this man's discomfort had not come from guilt, but from fear. And fear, she had learned, often meant a person already understood a danger they did not know how to safely reveal. Over the following days, Charlotte continued reviewing the records the Duchess had granted her access to, cross-referencing new documents against her hidden notes each night. She discovered further evidence of the scheme's reach, additional shipments quietly redirected, additional meetings held at obscure locations, far from the palace's watchful eyes. Each new detail confirmed what she already suspected, that Gareth Price was merely the visible thread of a far larger and more carefully hidden web. It was nearly 2 weeks later, while she was returning from the palace archives with a fresh set of records, that she encountered Colin Marsh directly, standing alone in a quiet garden courtyard, seemingly waiting for no one in particular. He glanced up as she approached, and something in his expression shifted the moment he recognized her. "Miss Hale," he said quietly, glancing briefly toward the surrounding windows before continuing. "I wondered if our paths might cross again." "Master Marsh," Charlotte said, matching his cautious tone. "I confess, I have hoped for the chance to speak with you privately." He studied her for a long moment, weighing something carefully behind his tired eyes. "You are asking questions that touch on matters I have long feared to speak of aloud," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have served this family for over 20 years, Miss Hale. I have watched good men destroyed by whispers they never saw coming, and I have stayed silent far longer than I am proud to admit." Charlotte felt her heart quicken. "Then you know something of what I am investigating." "I suspect more than I know for certain," Colin admitted. "But I have long believed the losses along the northern trade route are not the work of one man acting alone. Gareth Price is careful and clever in his own quiet way, but he lacks the influence needed to arrange meetings at estates far beyond the palace's ordinary reach. Someone above him grants him that access. Someone with far greater reason to see this family's fortunes weakened." "Do you have any idea who that might be?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a breath. Colin hesitated, glancing once more toward the surrounding windows before answering. "I have suspicions, Miss Hale, but suspicion without proof is a dangerous thing to speak aloud within these walls. I will say only this. Watch carefully who benefits should the Duke's position weaken. Watch who stands ready to step into whatever space is left behind, should this family's power falter." Before Charlotte could press him further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor beyond the courtyard, and Colin's expression shuddered instantly back into careful neutrality. "I have said more than I intended," he murmured. "Please, be careful, Miss Hale. Whoever is behind this will not welcome your attention kindly." He departed swiftly, leaving Charlotte alone in the quiet courtyard, with far more questions than answers, though his warnings settled deep and cold within her chest. Someone who would benefit from the Duke's weakened position. Someone with reason to see this powerful family falter. The possibilities stretched wide and troubling in her mind. Rival noble houses, ambitious relatives, perhaps even someone within the royal court itself, who viewed the Duke's growing influence as a threat to their own position. Whatever the truth, Charlotte understood now, with absolute clarity, that she had stepped into something far larger and more dangerous than a simple matter of stolen trade profits. And somewhere within that danger, quietly, carefully, unaware that she already knew the shape of his cruelty from another life entirely, Duke Edmund Cole remained blind to the threat, slowly closing in around his own household, a threat that Charlotte alone, among everyone in that palace, truly understood the shape of. That evening, as she added Colin Marsh's warning to her hidden collection of notes, Charlotte allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection. In her first life, she had walked into this same danger without any warning at all, trusting blindly in people who had ultimately betrayed her. This time, she had allies who recognized the danger, even if they did not yet understand its full shape. An ally in Henry, who supported her without hesitation, and now, perhaps, an unlikely ally in a tired old advisor who had carried his fears silently for far too long. It was not yet enough to expose the full conspiracy. But it was, Charlotte thought as she finally allowed herself to rest. Far more than she had ever possessed before the blade had fallen the first time. Weeks turned into months, and Charlotte's careful investigation began to take a clearer shape, though the picture that emerged troubled her more each time she examined it. She had followed Colin Marsh's advice, watching closely to see who might benefit from the Duke's weakened position, and slowly, a name began to surface again and again within the private letters and shipment records she reviewed each night. Lord Bertram Ashcombe, Vivian's own father, a nobleman whose family estates bordered the northern trade route, and who had, over the past several years, quietly acquired several smaller shipping contracts that had once belonged to the Duke's household. Charlotte stared at the connection for a long while, the night she first uncovered it, her candle burning low as she cross-referenced dates and signatures across a dozen scattered documents. Vivian Ashcombe, the very woman who had first approached her at the harbor warehouse, who had delivered the trade records into her hands, was the daughter of a man who stood to gain enormously should the Duke's financial standing collapse entirely. It seemed almost too convenient, too neat a solution, and Charlotte forced herself to consider it from every angle before allowing herself to believe it. Perhaps Vivian had approached her precisely because her father wished to appear helpful, to seem above suspicion by encouraging the very investigation that might one day expose him. Or perhaps Vivian herself did not know the full truth of her father's ambitions, and had approached Charlotte in genuine service to the Duchess, unaware of the danger her own family posed. Either possibility carried risk, and Charlotte understood that she would need far more than a pattern of convenient timing before she dared to name Lord Ashcombe directly to the Duchess. Accusing a powerful nobleman without solid proof could destroy her own credibility entirely, and worse, could alert the true architect of the conspiracy that she had come dangerously close to the truth. She brought her suspicions carefully to Henry, laying out the pattern of contracts and dates across her father's table late one evening after the household had gone to sleep. Henry studied the documents in silence for a long while, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "If you are right about this," he said finally, "you are not simply uncovering a corrupt steward skimming profits for his own gain. You are uncovering a nobleman's plot to weaken one of the most powerful families in the kingdom, likely with the intention of absorbing their trade routes and influence once the Duke's position collapses entirely." "I know," Charlotte said quietly, "which is precisely why I cannot move carelessly." "Then what will you do?" Henry asked. Charlotte considered the question for a long moment, turning over every possibility in her mind. "I need proof that connects Lord Ashcombe directly to Gareth Price," she said finally. "Something beyond convenient timing and inherited contracts. A letter, perhaps, or a witness willing to speak the truth." "And where do you intend to find such proof?" Henry asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected he would not like her answer. "I believe," Charlotte said slowly, "that Gareth Price keeps his own private records, somewhere within the ducal household, likely hidden from anyone who might stumble upon them by accident. If I could find a way to examine his private study, even briefly, I might find the connection I need." Henry's expression darkened with immediate concern. "Charlotte, that is not a small risk. If you are discovered searching through a ducal steward's private quarters, no explanation you offer will save you from suspicion, and worse, from whatever punishment Price and his true master might arrange for someone who has come too close to the truth." "I know the danger," Charlotte said, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I also know what happens if I do nothing. I have already lived through the consequences of staying silent while a conspiracy grew unchecked around me. I will not make that mistake again, even if the price of preventing it is dangerous." Henry was silent for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her and his growing respect for her resolve. "Then I will help you," he said finally, "though I insist on being nearby when you attempt whatever foolish plan you are already forming in that clever mind of yours." Over the following 2 weeks, Charlotte carefully studied the routines of the ducal household, learning through careful observation and quiet questions to the palace staff which hours Gareth Price spent away from his private study, attending to matters elsewhere within the estate. She learned that every third evening, he attended a private meeting with several other stewards to review household expenses, a meeting that typically lasted at least an hour, sometimes longer. On the appointed evening, Charlotte arrived at the palace, under the pretense of delivering additional trade documents to the Duchess's office, a task Vivian herself had arranged for her weeks earlier as part of her ongoing investigation. Henry waited outside the palace walls with the carriage, ready to create a distraction should anything go wrong. Charlotte's heart pounded steadily as she made her way through the quiet servant corridors toward Gareth Price's private study, moving with the calm, purposeful stride of someone who belonged exactly where she was, a skill she had learned long ago and refined through painful experience. The study door was locked, as she had expected, but she had prepared for this, carrying a small set of tools she had purchased quietly from a locksmith in the merchant quarter. tools she had practiced with alone in her room, until her hands moved with confident precision. The lock gave way after several tense moments, and Charlotte slipped into the dark study, closing the door softly behind her, before lighting a small shielded lamp she had brought for exactly this purpose. The room was neat and unremarkable, much like the man who occupied it, shelves of ledgers arranged in careful order, a plain wooden desk holding nothing but a few ordinary papers. She moved quickly, searching through drawers and shelves with practiced efficiency, aware of every passing minute, aware that discovery here would mean consequences far worse than anything she had faced in the harbor district. Beneath a false bottom in the lowest desk drawer, hidden with careful precision, she finally found what she had been searching for. A small collection of letters, tied together with plain string, written in a hand she did not recognize, but addressed, unmistakably, to Gareth Price himself. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the topmost letter, scanning its contents quickly by the dim light of her shielded lamp. The letter spoke plainly of continuing the arrangement along the northern route, of ensuring the losses remained small enough to avoid immediate suspicion, and it was signed, at the bottom, with a seal she recognized instantly from documents she had reviewed weeks earlier. The seal of Lord Bertram Ashcombe. Her suspicion had been correct, but before she could read further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Far too close, far too soon. Price's meeting had ended earlier than expected. Charlotte moved with swift, silent urgency, tucking one of the letters into the hidden pocket sewn within her gown, quickly restoring the remaining letters to their hidden compartment beneath the false drawer bottom. She extinguished her lamp and pressed herself into the shadowed corner behind a tall bookshelf, just as the study door opened, spilling lamplight across the room. Gareth Price entered, humming softly to himself, entirely unaware of how close he had come to catching the very woman who threatened to unravel everything he had helped build. Charlotte held perfectly still in the darkness, her heart hammering so loudly she feared he might somehow hear it, watching as he moved to his desk and began sorting through the ordinary papers she had left carefully undisturbed. For several agonizing minutes, Price remained at his desk, and Charlotte remained frozen in the shadows, until finally he rose again, gathered a few documents, and left the study once more, this time leaving the door unlocked behind him. Charlotte waited a full minute after his footsteps faded, before slipping silently from her hiding place and out through the servant corridors, her heart still racing, the stolen letter pressed tightly against her side, as though it might burn through the fabric of her gown. She reached Henry's carriage nearly 20 minutes later than planned, and his relief at seeing her safe was immediately replaced by alarm at the pale, shaken look on her face. "What happened?" he demanded, as the carriage pulled swiftly away from the palace grounds. "I found proof," Charlotte said quietly, her hands still trembling slightly, as she withdrew the folded letter from her hidden pocket. "Lord Ashcombe. He is behind this entirely, and Gareth Price is simply his instrument within the household." Henry stared at the letter, then at her, his expression a mixture of relief and continued worry. "Then it is done. You can bring this to the Duchess." "Not yet," Charlotte said, folding the letter carefully back into its hiding place. "One letter alone may not be enough to convince a duchess to move against one of her own court's most powerful noblemen. I need to understand how deep this reaches, and I need to ensure that when I finally reveal the truth, there is no possibility of it being dismissed or buried before justice can be served." Henry studied her for a long moment, clearly recognizing the same fierce determination that had carried her this far already. "Then we will find whatever else you need," he said simply. "But Charlotte, please, be more careful next time. I do not think my heart could survive another evening like this one." Charlotte allowed herself a small, tired smile, grateful beyond words for his steady loyalty. But even as relief settled over her at having finally uncovered the truth behind the conspiracy, a colder thought settled alongside it. Somewhere within the palace walls, unaware of how close his own household had come to ruin, Duke Edmund Cole continued to move through his days with the same careful, guarded coldness she remembered so painfully well. And soon, whether he wished it or not, Charlotte would be forced to bring this dangerous truth directly to his door. 3 days after her narrow escape from the ducal study, Charlotte began to notice small signs that unsettled her carefully guarded calm. A palace guard she did not recognize stood watching the harbor warehouse for nearly an hour, one afternoon, before disappearing without explanation. A letter she had sent to a trade contact in the northern provinces arrived back to her unopened, as though it had been intercepted and resealed clumsily before being returned. Nothing was proven, nothing was certain, but Charlotte's instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of learning to read danger before it fully revealed itself, told her that Gareth Price had discovered his missing letter and had begun quietly searching for whoever had taken it. She brought her concerns to Colin Marsh during a carefully arranged meeting in the same quiet garden courtyard where they had first spoken privately. The old advisor listened with growing alarm as she described the missing letter, the watching guard, the intercepted correspondence. "You took a great risk," Colin said quietly, his weathered face creased with worry. "If Price suspects you specifically, he will not act carelessly. He will wait, watch, and search for the perfect moment to remove the threat you pose, without drawing suspicion to himself." "Then I must move more quickly than he expects," Charlotte said. "I need to bring what I have found to the Duchess before Price and Lord Ashcombe have the chance to cover their tracks completely." Colin considered this carefully. "The letter you found proves a connection, but it does not prove the full scope of the scheme. If you bring only this to the Duchess, Lord Ashcombe will simply claim the letter was forged or misunderstood, and Price will find some clever explanation to protect himself. You need more than one piece of evidence. You need enough proof that no explanation could possibly account for it. What do you suggest?" Charlotte asked. Colin was quiet for a long moment, weighing something carefully behind his tired eyes. "I have access to certain household accounts that Price does not know I still review from time to time. Old habits from years of loyal service that no one has thought to question. If there are additional payments flowing from Lord Ashcombe's estate into accounts connected to Price or his associates, I may be able to trace them through records he believes are safely forgotten. Would you be willing to help me find them?" Charlotte asked, hope rising cautiously in her chest. Colin hesitated, clearly weighing the danger to himself against the greater danger of allowing the conspiracy to continue unchecked. "I have stayed silent for too many years already, Miss Hale," he said finally. "I will not stay silent any longer. Not when the truth finally has a chance of coming to light. Give me 2 weeks. I will find what proof I can, quietly and carefully, and bring it to you when I am certain it is safe to do so." Charlotte thanked him warmly, though she left their meeting with a heavy weight of urgency pressing against her chest. 2 weeks felt like an impossibly long time, given how closely Price now seemed to be watching, yet she understood the necessity of patience, of ensuring the proof they gathered would be strong enough to withstand whatever defense Lord Ashcombe might mount once accused. In the days that followed, Charlotte forced herself to appear as ordinary and unremarkable as possible, continuing her regular work with her father's shipping ledgers, meeting with merchant families as she always had, giving no outward sign of the danger quietly circling closer around her. Yet beneath her calm exterior, her mind never rested, turning over every possibility, every risk, every step still needed before she could finally bring the truth fully into the light. It was during this tense waiting period that she encountered Duke Edmund Cole again, quite by accident, at a modest gathering hosted by one of the Merchant Guild leaders, an event the Duke attended briefly out of formal courtesy rather than genuine interest. Charlotte had not expected to see him there, and the sight of him standing near the refreshment table, looking faintly bored amid the merchant crowd, sent an unexpected jolt through her carefully composed calm. He noticed her almost immediately, his expression shifting from polite boredom to something more alert. "Miss Hale," he said, approaching with measured steps, "I did not expect to find you at a gathering such as this." "I might say the same of you, Your Grace," Charlotte replied, keeping her tone light despite the tension coiled beneath her composure. "I was not aware dukes attended Merchant Guild celebrations." "Rarely," Edmund admitted, a faint, almost reluctant smile touching the corner of his mouth. "My mother insisted, believing it wise, to maintain goodwill among the merchant houses, given recent uncertainties in trade. I confess I find such gatherings tedious, though the company here tonight has proven more interesting than I expected." Charlotte felt her pulse quicken at the implication behind his words, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I hope your investigation into the northern trade matter has not caused you undue worry, Your Grace." His expression sobered slightly. "It has caused considerable worry, if I am honest. My mother trusts your judgment completely, Miss Hale, and I find myself increasingly inclined to share that trust, though I confess it does not come easily to me." "Trust rarely comes easily to those who have learned to expect betrayal," Charlotte said quietly, the words slipping out before she could fully consider their weight. Edmund studied her closely, something curious and searching in his gaze. You speak as though from experience, Miss Hale, despite your young age. Charlotte held his gaze steadily, aware of how close she stood to revealing far more than she intended. Perhaps I simply understand, Your Grace, that those who wish to do harm rarely announce their intentions openly. It is often the quiet, unremarkable people closest to us who pose the greatest danger. Something in her tone seemed to strike him more deeply than she intended, and for a brief moment, his careful composure wavered, revealing something almost vulnerable beneath the cold exterior she remembered so painfully well. I have learned that lesson myself, he said quietly, though perhaps not as thoroughly as I once believed. Before either of them could say more, Vivian Ashcombe appeared at Edmund's side, smoothly inserting herself into the conversation, with practiced ease. Your Grace, the Guildmaster wishes a word before the evening concludes. Edmund's expression shuddered instantly back into careful neutrality, and he offered Charlotte a brief, formal bow, before allowing Vivian to lead him away. Charlotte watched him go, her mind racing, with the strange, unexpected warmth of their brief exchange, quickly followed by a colder, more urgent thought. Vivian had appeared at precisely the moment their conversation grew too personal, too revealing. Whether by simple coincidence or deliberate design, Charlotte could not yet be certain, but she understood, with growing unease, that Vivian Ashcombe watched far more closely than her pleasant, polished exterior suggested, and that the daughter of Lord Bertram Ashcombe might prove to be a far more dangerous player in this unfolding conspiracy than Charlotte had initially believed. The following morning, Charlotte added a new, urgent note to her hidden collection beneath the floorboards. Watch Vivian Ashcombe closely. She may know more than she reveals, and she may not be the innocent messenger she appears to be. The pieces of the conspiracy were finally beginning to align into a clear and dangerous picture, yet Charlotte understood, with the hard-earned wisdom of a woman who had already died once from underestimating the danger around her, that the most difficult and perilous part of her journey had only just begun. The 2 weeks Colin Marsh had requested stretched into 3, each day heavier with tension than the last. Charlotte continued her outward routine of ledgers and merchant meetings, but beneath the surface, she felt the net closing slowly around her, an unshakable sense that Gareth Price's suspicion had grown from vague unease into something far more focused. She noticed the same unfamiliar guard near the harbor warehouse twice more, and once, returning home late from a meeting with Henry, she was certain she heard footsteps trailing her through the narrow merchant quarter streets, footsteps that vanished the moment she turned to look. She said nothing of this to her father, not wishing to burden him with fears she could not yet fully explain, but she began taking greater care with her hidden notes, moving them twice to new locations within her room, memorizing key details so that even if the physical pages were discovered, the most damning knowledge would remain safely locked within her own memory. It was on a rainy evening, nearly a month after their last meeting, that Colin Marsh finally sent word through a trusted household servant, requesting Charlotte's presence at a small chapel on the outskirts of the city, a place he claimed no one from the palace would think to search for either of them. Charlotte arrived just after dusk, her cloak soaked through from the steady rain, to find Colin waiting nervously near the chapel's rear entrance, a leather satchel clutched tightly against his chest. I found what we needed, he said without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. Payments, Miss Hale, flowing directly from Lord Ashcombe's private accounts into a merchant house, controlled quietly by Gareth Price's cousin. Disguised as ordinary trade dealings, but the amounts are far too large, and far too regular, to be anything but payment for services rendered. He handed her the satchel, and Charlotte opened it carefully, scanning the documents within by the dim light filtering through the chapel's narrow windows. Detailed records, carefully copied in Colin's careful hand, showed a pattern of payments stretching back nearly 4 years, coinciding precisely with the timeline of losses she had already uncovered along the northern trade route. This is enough, Charlotte breathed, relief and renewed urgency warring within her chest. Combined with the letter I found, this should be more than sufficient to convince the Duchess of the full scope of the conspiracy. There is more you should know, Colin said, his expression darkening further. I overheard, quite by accident, a conversation between Price and one of his household associates 2 nights ago. They spoke of accelerating their plans, of ensuring the northern losses grow significantly worse within the coming months, severe enough to force the Duke into a position where he must either seek an alliance with Lord Ashcombe's family or risk losing standing among the other noble houses entirely. Charlotte's blood ran cold at the implication. An alliance, she repeated slowly. Marriage, perhaps, to bind the two households together, allowing Lord Ashcombe to absorb the Duke's power and influence from within, rather than through open conflict. It would explain a great deal, Colin agreed grimly. Vivian Ashcombe has spent considerable time in the Duke's company these past months, has she not? Charlotte felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her, remembering how smoothly Vivian had inserted herself into her conversation with Edmund at the merchant gathering, how carefully she seemed to manage every moment the Duke spent in Charlotte's presence. If Lord Ashcombe intended to secure his family's power through marriage, weakening the Duke's finances until he had no choice but to accept such an alliance, then every piece of the conspiracy suddenly made a far more dangerous and personal kind of sense. "We must bring this to the Duchess immediately," Charlotte said, gathering the satchel close against her chest. "Every day we wait risks Price accelerating his plans further, and risks Edmund being pushed into an alliance built entirely on manipulation and deceit." Colin nodded, though his expression remained tense with worry. "Be careful how you present this, Miss Hale. If Lord Ashcombe learns his scheme has been discovered before the Duchess has the chance to act decisively, he may find ways to destroy this evidence, or worse, to silence those who uncovered it." Charlotte returned home that night, soaked through with rain, and trembling with a mixture of triumph and fear, understanding that the coming days would determine whether the conspiracy she had worked so tirelessly to expose would finally be brought to justice, or whether it would find some final, desperate way to protect itself, at her expense. She sent word to the Duchess the following morning, requesting an urgent private audience regarding the northern trade matter, careful to phrase her request in language that suggested nothing beyond routine progress, unwilling to risk any hint of the true urgency, reaching eyes other than the Duchess's own. The response came swiftly, granting her an audience within 2 days' time. Those 2 days passed with agonizing slowness, each hour bringing fresh anxiety that something might go wrong before she had the chance to present her evidence. Henry insisted on accompanying her as far as the palace gates once again, his own nerves clearly frayed by the growing danger surrounding their efforts. "Whatever happens," he said, as their carriage approached the palace grounds, "know that you have done everything within your power to bring this truth to light. No one could ask more of you than that." Charlotte squeezed his hand gratefully, drawing strength from his steady presence, before stepping from the carriage and making her way once again through the palace's grand corridors toward the private council chamber, where she had first presented her findings months earlier. This time, only the Duchess awaited her, having wisely chosen to keep the audience private and discreet, given the sensitivity of what Charlotte had requested to discuss. Duchess Agatha's sharp eyes studied Charlotte carefully as she entered, immediately sensing the gravity carried in her composed but tense expression. "You have found something significant," the Duchess said, gesturing for Charlotte to sit. "I can see it plainly upon your face." "I have, Your Grace," Charlotte said, withdrawing the satchel of documents and laying them carefully across the table. "I believe I have uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy behind the northern trade losses, and I fear the danger it poses reaches far beyond simple theft." She laid out the evidence methodically, the letter bearing Lord Ashcombe's seal, the detailed payment records Colin had risked so much to uncover, the overheard conversation suggesting the scheme was accelerating toward some final, decisive push. The Duchess listened in growing silence, her expression hardening with each new piece of evidence, until finally, when Charlotte finished, the older woman sat back in her chair with an expression of controlled, furious clarity. "Lord Ashcombe," Duchess Agatha said slowly, her voice cold with restrained anger, "I suspected some rival influence at work, but I confess I did not expect it to be a family we have long considered among our closest allies." "There is one further matter I must raise, Your Grace," Charlotte said carefully, "though I do so with great hesitation, as it touches upon a delicate and personal matter." The Duchess's sharp gaze fixed upon her. "Speak plainly, Miss Hale. I have little patience remaining for delicate hesitation, given what you have just revealed. I believe," Charlotte said, choosing her words with utmost care, "that Lord Ashcombe intends for this scheme to weaken the Duke's position, specifically to force a marriage alliance between your family and his own. likely through Lady Vivian. I cannot yet prove this intention directly, but the pattern of Vivian's involvement throughout this entire matter, combined with the timing of the scheme's planned acceleration, suggests this outcome may be precisely what Lord Ashcombe hopes to achieve. The Duchess was silent for a long, tense moment, her expression unreadable as she absorbed this final, troubling piece of the puzzle. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of both fury and something close to gratitude.
You have done this family a great service, Miss Hale, one I do not believe I can adequately repay.
I will bring this evidence before the Duke immediately, and we will decide together how best to proceed against Lord Ashcombe and his conspirators within our own household. Charlotte rose to leave, relief and lingering unease mingling within her chest, in equal measure. As she reached the chamber door, the Duchess spoke once more, her tone softer now, almost curious. "Miss Hale," she said, "may I ask why you have pursued this matter with such fierce dedication, at such personal risk to yourself? Most young women in your position would have quietly stepped away the moment the danger became clear." Charlotte paused at the door, considering the question carefully, before answering with the closest truth she could offer. "Because, Your Grace, I understand better than most what it costs an innocent person when the guilty are allowed to hide behind another's ruin. I could not, in good conscience, allow that to happen again, not when I had the power to prevent it." The Duchess studied her for a long, thoughtful moment, something like understanding flickering behind her sharp eyes, though she did not press further. Charlotte left the palace that evening, with the satchel finally empty of its damning evidence, carried instead in the Duchess's own capable hands, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that justice, this time, might finally be within reach. But as her carriage pulled away from the palace gates, she could not shake the uneasy certainty that Gareth Price and Lord Ashcombe would not simply accept defeat quietly, and that whatever desperate measures they might take to protect themselves once they realized their scheme had been discovered, the coming days would prove more dangerous than anything Charlotte had yet faced in this second, hard-won life. She did not have to wait long to discover how right her instincts had been. 3 nights after her audience with the Duchess, a message arrived at the harbor house well past midnight, delivered by a breathless young servant boy who refused to give his name before vanishing back into the darkness. The message was brief, scrawled in Colin Marsh's shaking hand. "Price knows the records are missing. He suspects me. Meet me at the chapel at dawn if you can. Trust no one else until then." Charlotte's heart pounded as she read the words twice over, fear coiling tightly in her chest. She woke Henry with an urgent note sent through her father's household runner, and by the first gray light of dawn, the two of them arrived together at the small chapel on the outskirts of the city, both braced for whatever news awaited them. But the chapel stood empty and silent, its rear entrance left unlocked and slightly ajar, swinging gently in the cold morning breeze. Charlotte's stomach dropped as she stepped inside, calling softly for Colin, receiving only silence in return. A single leather glove lay abandoned near the altar steps, one she recognized instantly as belonging to the old advisor. "He was here," Henry said quietly, examining the scene with a grim expression. "And something happened before he could meet us." Charlotte felt a cold, sick dread settle deep within her chest. She thought of Colin's tired, weathered face, his quiet courage in finally breaking decades of careful silence to help her expose the truth, and the thought that her actions might have led directly to some terrible fate befalling him was almost more than she could bear. "We must return to the palace immediately," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "The Duchess must know that Price has moved against Colin. If we wait, we may lose whatever chance remains to save him, and to prevent Price from destroying any remaining evidence before justice can be served." They rushed back toward the palace as quickly as the carriage could carry them, Charlotte's mind racing through every possible scenario, each one darker than the last. Had Price discovered Colin's betrayal and taken drastic measures to silence him permanently? Had he simply been detained somewhere within the palace, prevented from reaching the chapel in time? She did not know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her with every passing minute. Upon arriving at the palace, Charlotte requested immediate audience with the Duchess, her urgency plain enough that the guards did not hesitate to escort her through swiftly, despite the early hour. She found the Duchess already awake, her expression grave, as though she too had received troubling news overnight. "Miss Hale," the Duchess said before Charlotte could even speak, "I was about to send for you. Colin Marsh was found early this morning, unconscious near the eastern garden wall, struck down by an unknown assailant. He is alive, though badly injured, and has not yet regained consciousness enough to speak of what happened to him. Relief and horror warred within Charlotte's chest at the news. Relief that Colin still lived. Horror that her investigation had brought such danger directly to a man who had risked everything to help her. Your Grace, I believe this confirms beyond any remaining doubt that Gareth Price has discovered the missing records, and grown desperate enough to silence anyone who might expose him. I agree, the Duchess said grimly. I have already ordered Price detained for questioning, though he claims complete ignorance of the attack on Colin Marsh. Without a witness able to speak against him directly, I fear he may yet find some clever way to avoid full accountability. Then we must move quickly to secure whatever remains of the evidence before he has the chance to destroy it entirely, Charlotte said, her earlier fear hardening into fierce determination. And we must ensure Colin receives whatever care he needs to recover, and eventually, to speak the truth of what he witnessed. The Duchess studied her for a long moment, something like renewed respect, flickering behind her sharp, weary eyes. You have shown remarkable courage throughout this entire ordeal, Miss Hale. Courage I have rarely witnessed, even among seasoned advisors twice your age. I will see to Colin's care personally, and I will ensure Price remains detained until we have gathered enough proof to see him and Lord Ashcombe both brought fully to justice. As Charlotte left the Duchess's chambers, she found Edmund waiting in the corridor outside, his expression tense and unreadable, though something in his eyes suggested he had already heard news of the morning's events. He fell into step beside her without a word at first, walking together in tense silence toward the palace's outer courtyard. My mother tells me you have uncovered proof of a conspiracy reaching into Lord Ashcombe's household, he said finally, his voice low and carefully controlled, and that an innocent advisor has now been gravely injured as a result of exposing it. I fear that is precisely what has happened, Your Grace, Charlotte said quietly. Edmund stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression a complicated mixture of anger, gratitude, and something else Charlotte could not quite name. You have risked your own safety repeatedly throughout this investigation, Miss Hale, for a household that owes you nothing beyond a modest commission for your services. Why? Charlotte held his gaze, feeling the weight of everything she could not yet tell him pressing heavily against her chest. Because, Your Grace, some debts are not measured in coin, and some wrongs, once witnessed, cannot simply be ignored, regardless of whether they touch us directly or not. Something shifted in his expression then, something that looked almost like the beginning of genuine trust, fragile and uncertain, yet undeniably present for the first time since they had met again in this new life. Whatever comes next in this matter, he said quietly, know that I do not intend to forget the courage you have shown in bringing it to light. Charlotte said nothing in response, though as she watched him walk away moments later, she felt a strange, unsettling mixture of vindication and lingering sorrow, remembering all too clearly how easily that same trust had shattered into cold, unmoved judgment in her first life. She could not yet know whether this fragile beginning of trust between them would prove any sturdier than the one that had once led her to a blade and a silent, unforgiving crowd. But for now, with Colin Marsh fighting for his recovery and Gareth Price finally detained within the palace walls, Charlotte allowed herself the smallest, most cautious flicker of hope that justice, however delayed, however dangerous the path toward it had proven, might finally be within reach. News of Gareth Price's detainment could not remain contained within the palace walls for long, and within days, whispers of scandal began spreading through the capital like wildfire through dry grass. Merchants speculated openly at the harbor about corruption within the ducal household. Court nobles exchanged knowing glances at social gatherings, careful never to speak too loudly, though everyone seemed to sense that something significant was unraveling behind the palace's carefully maintained facade of stability. Lord Bertram Ashcombe, upon learning of Price's detainment, did not remain passive. Within a week, he had launched his own counterattack, arriving at the palace with a retinue of lawyers and allies, loudly proclaiming his outrage that his own household's name had been dragged into baseless accusations stemming from stolen and likely forged documents. He demanded to see whatever evidence had been gathered against him, insisting that a merchant's daughter with no formal standing at court had no business leveling such serious accusations against a nobleman of his standing. Charlotte found herself summoned once again to the palace, this time to face Lord Ashcombe directly, in a formal hearing before the Duchess and several senior court officials. A confrontation she had known was inevitable, but had still hoped to delay a while longer, until Colin Marsh had recovered enough to add his own testimony to her evidence. Lord Ashcombe cut an imposing figure in the council chamber, tall and broad-shouldered, his voice booming with practiced confidence as he addressed the assembled officials. "I have served this kingdom loyally for over 20 years, he declared, and I will not stand silently while a young woman with no formal training and no true understanding of court politics attempts to destroy my family's reputation based on a single stolen letter that could easily have been forged or misinterpreted." Charlotte stood calmly amid the tension, refusing to let his booming confidence unsettle her carefully prepared composure. "The letter bears your own seal, Lord Ashcombe," she said evenly. "A seal not easily forged, and one that matches precisely the payment records showing regular transfers from your private accounts into a merchant house controlled by Gareth Price's own cousin." "Coincidence," Lord Ashcombe snapped. "My family conducts extensive trade dealings across this kingdom. It would be remarkable indeed if none of those dealings happened to touch, even distantly, upon a household connected to a ducal steward." "Then perhaps," Charlotte said, "Lord Ashcombe would be willing to explain the overheard conversation regarding plans to accelerate losses along the northern route, plans intended specifically to force the Duke into seeking an alliance with your own family." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the assembled officials at this direct accusation, and Lord Ashcombe's confident expression flickered, just briefly, before hardening once more into indignant fury. "Hearsay," he declared. "An overheard conversation reported second-hand by an advisor with a documented history of failing health and fading memory in recent years." Charlotte felt a flash of anger at the casual cruelty of his words, dismissing Colin's courage and sacrifice so easily, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, understanding that emotion would only weaken her position in this moment. "Colin Marsh's memory has served this household faithfully for over 20 years, Lord Ashcombe, and I believe his testimony, once he has recovered sufficiently to provide it formally, will prove far more reliable than the convenient excuses you continue to offer this council." Duchess Agatha, who had remained largely silent throughout the heated exchange, finally spoke, her voice cool and authoritative. "Lord Ashcombe, until Colin Marsh recovers enough to provide his full testimony, and until we have thoroughly examined all evidence gathered in this matter, you will remain under close observation, and any further attempts at trade dealings along the northern route will be suspended pending the outcome of this investigation." Lord Ashcombe's face flushed with barely restrained fury at this pronouncement, though he had little choice but to accept it given the Duchess's clear authority in the matter. "This is an outrage," he said stiffly, "and I assure you, Duchess, that once this baseless accusation collapses under proper scrutiny, I will expect a full and public apology for the damage done to my family's reputation." He stormed from the chamber shortly after, leaving behind a tense, uncertain silence. Charlotte remained standing quietly amid the murmuring officials, aware that while she had held her ground successfully in this confrontation, the true battle for justice had only just begun, and Lord Ashcombe would not simply retreat quietly while his ambitions and reputation remained under such serious threat. In the weeks that followed, the scandal deepened its grip on the capital's attention. Whispers grew louder, transforming from cautious speculation into open discussion at nearly every social gathering among the noble houses. Several other merchant families, encouraged by Charlotte's willingness to speak openly against corruption, came forward with their own long-held suspicions regarding irregular dealings connected to Lord Ashcombe's estate, adding further weight to the mounting evidence against him. Edmund, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn into private conversations with Charlotte as the investigation progressed, seeking her insight not merely as a hired consultant, but as someone whose judgment he had genuinely come to trust and value. Their meetings, though always conducted with careful propriety, grew steadily longer, filled with discussions that extended well beyond the immediate matter of the conspiracy, into broader questions of governance, justice, and the delicate balance of power among the noble houses. "You see patterns others miss," Edmund said to her one afternoon, as they reviewed additional trade records together in a quiet corner of the palace library. "Not simply patterns of numbers and contracts, but patterns of character, of motive. It is a rare gift. It is simply a matter of paying close attention, Charlotte said, echoing words she had spoken to him once before. Though this time, there was no coldness between them, only a growing, cautious warmth she had not expected to feel again toward this man, despite everything she remembered of his cruelty in another life. "You say that as though it were simple," Edmund replied, a faint smile touching his usually guarded expression. "Yet I have known advisors twice your age who possess nothing close to your clarity of judgment." Charlotte felt an unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest at his words, quickly followed by a sharp pang of caution. She reminded herself firmly that this version of Edmund, however different he seemed from the cold, unmoved man who had once watched her execution without protest, had not yet been tested by the true weight of power and betrayal. She did not yet know whether the warmth growing between them now would survive whatever trials still lay ahead, or whether it would ultimately crumble beneath the same harsh instincts that had destroyed her before. Yet despite her careful caution, she found herself, almost against her own will, beginning to hope that perhaps this time, things might unfold differently between them. That hope, however fragile and uncertain, would soon be tested more severely than she could have anticipated, for even as the evidence against Lord Ashcombe and Gareth Price continued to mount, a far more dangerous truth was quietly beginning to surface, one that would soon reveal that the conspiracy Charlotte had worked so tirelessly to expose reached even deeper into the ducal household than anyone had yet suspected. That deeper truth began to surface through Colin Marsh himself, who, after nearly 3 weeks of careful recovery under the Duchess's personal physician, finally regained enough strength to speak clearly of the attack against him. Charlotte was present, along with the Duchess and 2 senior court officials, when Colin recounted the events of that fateful morning at the chapel. "I never reached the chapel," Colin said weakly from his sickbed, his voice still rough with strain. "I was intercepted along the road, struck from behind before I could see my attacker clearly, but I heard voices before I lost consciousness, 2 voices, discussing what to do with me. One was unmistakably Gareth Price. The other, I am certain, though it grieves me deeply to say it, belonged to Lady Vivian Ashcombe." A heavy silence fell across the room at this revelation. Charlotte felt a cold, sinking confirmation settle within her chest. The suspicion she had carried quietly for weeks now given painful, undeniable weight. Vivian Ashcombe was not simply an unwitting messenger caught between her father's ambitions and her duty to the Duchess. She was, it seemed, an active and willing participant in the conspiracy from the very beginning. "Are you certain of this, Master Marsh?" the Duchess asked gravely. "This is an extremely serious accusation." "I am certain, Your Grace," Colin said firmly, despite his obvious physical weakness. "I have served this household long enough to recognize Lady Vivian's voice, even in the depths of confusion and pain." She spoke calmly, almost coldly, discussing whether it would be wiser to eliminate me entirely, or simply ensure I remained silent through fear. Charlotte felt a chill run through her at the casual cruelty implied in those words, though it did not entirely surprise her, given everything she had already suspected of Vivian's careful, calculated involvement throughout the entire scheme. She thought back to that first meeting at the harbor warehouse, to every subsequent interaction, searching her memory for signs she might have missed, moments where Vivian's polished warmth had perhaps concealed something far colder and more dangerous beneath. "This changes the situation considerably," the Duchess said, her expression hardening with renewed determination. "If Lady Vivian has been an active participant, rather than an unwitting pawn, then she must be questioned directly, and swiftly, before she has further opportunity to align her testimony with her father's defense." Charlotte was present 2 days later, when Vivian Ashcombe was brought before the Duchess for formal questioning, and she watched carefully as the young noblewoman's composed, elegant manner remained largely intact despite the gravity of the accusations laid before her. Vivian denied everything with practiced ease, insisting that Colin Marsh's testimony was clearly the confused ramblings of a man recovering from serious injury, unreliable and unfit to serve as evidence against her. "I have served the Duchess faithfully for 3 years, Vivian said, her voice steady and wounded, playing the role of falsely accused loyalty with impressive skill. "I cannot understand why I would be accused of such terrible acts against my own household's interests." Charlotte watched her closely throughout the questioning, noting the small, almost imperceptible tension in Vivian's hands. Then she the way her gaze flickered briefly toward the door each time a new piece of evidence was raised, as though calculating her chances of escape should the questioning grow too dangerous. It was the same careful calculation Charlotte remembered witnessing, too late, in her first life, among the very people who had ultimately betrayed her. "Lady Vivian," Charlotte said quietly, breaking her silence for the first time during the questioning. "When you first approached me at the harbor warehouse, nearly a year ago, you claimed the Duchess herself had sent you to seek my opinion on the northern trade matter. Yet the Duchess has confirmed she gave no such specific instruction, only a general wish for outside counsel on trade matters overall. Why did you choose me specifically, and why did you frame the request as coming directly from the Duchess when it did not?" Vivian's composed expression flickered, just briefly, before she recovered her careful control. "I believed it would carry more weight coming from the Duchess's authority," she said smoothly. "I meant no deception by it." "And yet," Charlotte continued evenly, "it was you who delivered the very records that eventually led me to uncover your own father's involvement in this scheme. Why would you provide the exact evidence needed to expose your own family's conspiracy, unless you believed, at the time, that I would either fail to understand its significance, or that you could control how much of the truth I ultimately uncovered?" The room fell into tense silence, as Vivian struggled visibly to formulate a response, her earlier composure finally beginning to crack beneath the weight of Charlotte's careful, methodical questioning. "I did not expect," she said finally, her voice losing some of its practiced smoothness, "that a merchant's daughter would prove so remarkably persistent in uncovering details I believed safely buried." The admission, though carefully incomplete, was enough. The Duchess's expression turned to cold, controlled fury as she rose from her seat. "Lady Vivian Ashcombe, you will remain under close guard within the palace until this matter has been fully resolved. Your father's fate, and now your own, will be decided once the full truth has been laid before the royal court." As guards escorted Vivian from the chamber, her composed mask finally shattering into something closer to genuine fear, Charlotte felt a complicated mixture of vindication and unease settle over her. The conspiracy she had worked so tirelessly to expose was finally unraveling completely. Yet the personal betrayal, woven throughout it, the calculated cruelty hidden behind Vivian's polished friendliness, left Charlotte with an uncomfortable reminder of how easily deception could hide behind even the most convincing appearances of warmth and loyalty. Edmund, who had remained silent throughout much of the questioning, approached Charlotte quietly once the chamber had emptied, his expression troubled and thoughtful. "I considered Vivian Ashcombe something close to a friend," he admitted quietly. "It is a difficult thing, to learn how thoroughly someone can conceal their true intentions behind a mask of loyalty." "It is," Charlotte agreed softly, thinking of her own painful history with betrayal. Though she said nothing further of the truth, she still carried, carefully hidden within her own heart. "I find myself grateful," Edmund continued, "that you possess the rare ability to see through such masks, Miss Hale. I do not know how this household would have fared without your persistence and clarity throughout this entire ordeal." Charlotte offered him a small, careful smile, though inside, she could not help but wonder how differently he might feel toward her, once he finally learned the full truth of who she truly was, and what role his own cold judgment had once played in ending her life entirely. That reckoning, she understood with quiet certainty, could not be delayed forever. The formal trial of Lord Bertram Ashcombe and Gareth Price was set to begin within a month, and in the tense weeks leading up to it, Charlotte found herself spending increasing amounts of time within the palace walls, assisting the Duchess's legal counsel in organizing the mounting evidence into a case strong enough to withstand whatever defense Lord Ashcombe's lawyers might attempt to mount. It was during this period of intense preparation that Edmund began seeking her out more frequently, not merely for matters directly related to the conspiracy, but for reasons that felt, increasingly, more personal than professional. He found her one evening in the palace library, long after most of the household had retired, poring over a stack of shipping records by candlelight. He entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of warm spiced wine, and set one down beside her without a word, before taking the seat across from her. "You work later than anyone else within these walls," he observed, watching her with a curious, searching expression. "Old habits," Charlotte said, accepting the cup gratefully, though she did not elaborate further on precisely how old those habits truly were, or the painful circumstances under which she had first learned the discipline of careful, late-night vigilance. Edmund studied her for a long moment in comfortable silence before speaking again, his voice quieter and more searching than she had heard it before. "Miss Hale, I find myself increasingly curious about you, and I confess, it is not merely professional curiosity any longer." Charlotte's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "What would you like to know, Your Grace?" "I have watched you these past months," Edmund said slowly. "Uncover a conspiracy that has taken this household completely by surprise, expose betrayal from people we trusted deeply, and do so with a composure and clarity that suggests wisdom far beyond your years. And yet, whenever I ask you directly about your past, about what shaped you into the woman you are, you offer only careful, incomplete answers. I find myself wondering what you are not telling me." Charlotte felt the familiar tightness rise in her chest, the old instinct to deflect, to protect herself, by revealing as little as possible. But she had also grown weary, over these long months, of carrying the full weight of her hidden truth, entirely alone. And something in Edmund's careful, genuine curiosity made her wonder, for the first time, whether a small piece of the truth might finally be safe to share. "There are things about my past," she said carefully, "that I have not spoken of to anyone, not fully, because I fear they would sound impossible, even to someone as open-minded as you have proven yourself to be these past months." Edmund leaned forward slightly, his expression intent and unusually gentle. "Try me, Miss Hale. I have learned a great deal these past months about how easily impossible-seeming truths can hide beneath ordinary appearances." Charlotte hesitated, weighing carefully how much she dared to reveal. She was not yet ready, she understood instinctively, to speak the full truth of her execution, of the second life she had been granted, of the painful memory of his own cold indifference as the blade fell. That truth, she sensed, would require far more trust between them than currently existed, trust that had not yet been fully tested by the trials still to come. "I have experienced betrayal before," she said instead, choosing her words with careful precision. "Betrayal so complete and so devastating that it changed everything about how I approach the world. I learned, through painful experience, never again to trust blindly, never again to assume that those closest to me would stand by me when danger came. That is why I have pursued this conspiracy so relentlessly, Your Grace. Because I understand, more intimately than I wish I did, what it costs an innocent person when those in power fail to see the truth before it is too late." Edmund's expression grew troubled, searching hers carefully, as though trying to piece together the fuller shape of whatever painful history lay behind her careful words. "Who betrayed you, Charlotte?" he asked quietly, using her given name for the first time since they had met, the intimacy of it sending an unexpected warmth through her chest, despite the heaviness of the conversation. "Someone I trusted completely," she said softly. "Someone I loved, in fact, though he never knew the full depth of that love, and someone whose judgment failed me so completely that I paid the highest possible price for his failure to see the truth." "What happened to him?" Edmund asked. Charlotte held his gaze for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything she still could not say, pressing heavily against her chest. "He has not yet paid for what he did," she said finally, the words carrying a double meaning. She hoped, perhaps, he might one day understand fully, though not tonight, not until the trial had run its course, and she understood more completely what kind of man he had truly become in this second chance at life. Perhaps he never fully will. But I have found, through everything that followed, a strength in myself I did not know I possessed, and I have chosen to use that strength to prevent others from suffering the same fate I once did." Edmund was silent for a long moment, clearly moved by her words, though clearly also sensing that there remained far more to her story than she had shared. "I am sorry," he said finally, his voice low and sincere, "for whatever pain you have carried, and for whatever failure of judgment cost you so dearly. I hope, in time, you might find it within yourself to trust again, at least in some small measure." Charlotte offered him a small, sad smile, thinking of how strange and painful it was to sit here now, receiving his gentle sympathy for a wound he himself had caused in another life he did not remember. A wound he was slowly, carefully, beginning to help heal, without any understanding of his own role in creating it. "Perhaps," she said softly, "I already have begun to, in small measure." Something shifted in Edmund's expression at her words. a warmth and vulnerability she had rarely glimpsed beneath his careful, guarded exterior. For a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke, the candlelight flickering gently between them as something fragile and uncertain continued to grow in the space where cold judgment had once existed in another life entirely. But even as that fragile warmth grew between them, Charlotte understood, with a clarity she could not ignore, that the true test of whatever trust was building between them still lay ahead. The trial of Lord Ashcombe and Gareth Price would soon bring the full weight of judgment and justice crashing down upon the ducal household, and within that trial, buried among all the evidence and testimony still to come, lay questions Charlotte was not yet certain Edmund was prepared to face. Questions about power, about mercy, about how easily even a good man's judgment could fail when tested by fear and uncertainty. She could only hope, as she finally bid him good night and made her way back through the quiet palace corridors toward her waiting carriage, that whatever man Edmund Cole had become in this second chance at life, he would prove himself different from the cold, unmoved Duke who had once let her die without a single word in her defense. The days leading up to the trial passed in a haze of careful preparation and mounting tension. Charlotte spent long hours with the Duchess's legal counsel, organizing testimony and evidence into a case sturdy enough to withstand the formidable defense Lord Ashcombe had assembled, a team of skilled lawyers determined to paint the entire investigation as a campaign of baseless accusation driven by jealousy and ambition rather than genuine wrongdoing. Colin Marsh, though still recovering his full strength, insisted on preparing his own testimony carefully, determined to speak the truth clearly and completely before the royal court, despite the danger it might invite from Lord Ashcombe's powerful allies. Charlotte visited him often during this period, grateful beyond words for his continued courage, and increasingly aware of how deeply she had come to respect this quiet, unassuming man who had risked everything to help her expose the truth. "You remind me of someone I knew many years ago," Colin told her during one such visit, his weathered face thoughtful as he studied her carefully. "A young advisor who served this household with remarkable clarity and courage, before circumstances I never fully understood led to her sudden downfall. I have often wondered, over the years, whether that downfall was entirely deserved, or whether it, too, was the product of some conspiracy no one thought to investigate closely enough." Charlotte's breath caught at his words, her heart pounding, with sudden, careful hope. "What do you mean, Master Marsh?" Colin's expression grew distant, clearly reaching back through years of careful, guarded memory. "It was many years before you were born, or nearly so. A young woman, gifted with sharp instincts much like your own, was accused of treason and executed swiftly, before the full truth of the matter could ever be properly examined. I always suspected something was amiss in how quickly that judgment was carried out, though I never had the courage, then, to speak my doubts aloud." Charlotte felt a strange, dizzying mixture of validation and grief wash over her, understanding that even in this timeline, in this second life, some quiet corner of the household had recognized, however faintly, the injustice of what had once happened to her. "What was her name?" she asked softly, though she already knew, with painful certainty, exactly whose story he was describing. But before Colin could answer, a servant arrived to inform them that the Duchess required Charlotte's presence immediately, and the conversation was left unfinished, a loose thread Charlotte carried with her throughout the following days, wondering whether Colin's careful memory held some clue that might yet prove important as the trial approached. On the evening before the trial was set to begin, Edmund sought her out once more, finding her in the same quiet corner of the palace library where their earlier conversation had taken place. His expression tonight carried a heaviness she had not seen before, the weight of impending judgment clearly pressing upon him. "Tomorrow, my household's reputation, and perhaps its very future, will be decided before the full royal court," he said quietly, settling into the seat across from her. "I find myself grateful, Charlotte, that whatever comes of it, the truth will finally be laid bare, rather than allowed to fester quietly beneath the surface, as it has for years." "The truth is always worth the risk of bringing it to light," Charlotte said softly, no matter how painful or dangerous that process might prove. Edmund studied her closely, something searching and unusually vulnerable in his gaze. "I find myself wondering, more and more, what led you to believe so completely in that principle. I sense there is a deeper story behind your conviction, one you have not yet fully shared with me." Charlotte held his gaze, feeling the familiar pull between caution and the growing desire to finally share the full truth of who she was and what she had endured. But something told her, deep within her carefully guarded heart, that tomorrow's trial would prove a crucial test of Edmund's true character, a test that would reveal, once and for all, whether he had truly grown beyond the cold, unmoved judgment that had once cost her everything, or whether that same coldness still lived somewhere beneath his gentler exterior, waiting to resurface when true pressure finally arrived. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "once tomorrow's trial has concluded, and the truth of this conspiracy has been fully judged, I will share more of my own story with you. But for now, Your Grace, I believe we both need to rest, and to prepare ourselves for whatever tomorrow may bring." Edmund nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he sensed the significance of her careful promise, the weight of a truth still waiting patiently to be revealed. "Then I will hold you to that promise, Charlotte," he said softly, rising to take his leave. "Whatever tomorrow brings, I find myself grateful beyond words that fate saw fit to bring you into this household's troubles, even if I do not yet fully understand why." As he departed, Charlotte remained alone in the quiet library, her heart heavy with the knowledge that tomorrow's trial would determine far more than simply the fate of Lord Ashcombe and Gareth Price. It would reveal, at long last, whether the man she had once loved and lost in another life had truly changed enough to deserve the fragile trust now growing so carefully between them, or whether history, in its cruel and unpredictable fashion, was destined to repeat itself once again. The royal court chamber overflowed with spectators the morning the trial began, nobles and merchants alike crowding into the galleries to witness what had already become the most talked-about scandal the capital had seen in years. Charlotte sat near the front, alongside the Duchess's legal counsel, her heart pounding steadily as Lord Ashcombe entered, flanked by his team of lawyers, his expression composed and confident despite the weight of evidence gathered against him. The proceedings opened, with the prosecution laying out the full scope of the conspiracy, presenting the letters, the payment records, and finally, Colin Marsh's careful testimony, delivered with quiet dignity despite his lingering weakness from the attack that had nearly taken his life. The gathered court listened in tense silence as Colin recounted the overheard conversation between Price and Vivian Ashcombe, his voice steady and unwavering, despite the obvious difficulty of speaking such damning words against people he had once considered part of his household's trusted circle. Lord Ashcombe's defense, however, proved more cunning than Charlotte had anticipated. Rather than simply denying the evidence outright, his lawyers shifted their strategy toward a far more dangerous line of attack, one aimed not merely at discrediting the accusations, but at shifting blame onto the ducal household itself. If such extensive corruption truly existed within Lord Ashcombe's dealings, the lead defense lawyer argued, addressing the assembled judges with practiced confidence, then surely the Duke's own household bears significant responsibility for failing to notice such irregularities for years. Duke Edmund Cole himself signed off on numerous trade agreements connected to these supposed losses. If negligence and poor oversight allowed this conspiracy to flourish for so long, should not the Duke himself bear equal scrutiny for his failure to protect his own household's interests? A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the gallery at this unexpected turn, and Charlotte felt a cold jolt of alarm as she glanced toward Edmund, seated near the front of the chamber alongside his mother. His expression remained carefully composed, though she could see the tension tightening around his eyes. The sudden, unwelcome realization that this trial, which he had believed would simply vindicate his household against Lord Ashcombe's treachery, might instead turn its harsh scrutiny upon his own judgment and leadership. The presiding judges, clearly troubled by this new line of argument, called for a brief recess to consider how to proceed, and Charlotte found herself approached almost immediately by the Duchess's legal counsel, his expression grim with concern. "This is a dangerous strategy," he told her quietly, as they conferred in a private antechamber during the recess. "If the court begins to view this matter as evidence of the Duke's own negligence, rather than purely as Lord Ashcombe's calculated betrayal, it could severely damage the household's standing, regardless of whether Ashcombe himself is ultimately convicted." Charlotte's mind raced, searching for some way to counter this unexpected threat. She understood, with painful clarity, the bitter irony unfolding before her. In her first life, She had been the one unjustly blamed for a conspiracy orchestrated by others, her own innocence disregarded entirely by a household eager to protect its reputation at any cost. Now, that same household faced the possibility of similar unjust blame, and she found herself, unexpectedly, determined to prevent it from happening to Edmund the way it had once happened to her. When the court reconvened, Charlotte requested permission to address the judges directly, a request the presiding judge granted, with visible curiosity, given her central role throughout the entire investigation. "It is true," Charlotte said, addressing the assembled court with careful, measured confidence, that Duke Edmund Cole signed numerous trade agreements connected to the northern route over the past several years. But signing an agreement is not the same as orchestrating deception. Lord Ashcombe's scheme was specifically designed to appear as ordinary market misfortune, hidden behind carefully falsified records that even trained officials within the household failed to detect for years. I myself required months of careful investigation to uncover the full pattern, despite dedicating my complete attention to the task. To suggest that the Duke bears equal blame for failing to notice what an entire household of experienced advisors also failed to detect is not justice. It is simply an attempt to shift blame away from the true architect of this conspiracy. She paused, letting her words settle over the chamber before continuing, her voice growing firmer with conviction. "I have seen, in circumstances I understand perhaps better than anyone in this room, what happens when the innocent are punished for the crimes of the guilty, simply because it proves more convenient than pursuing the more difficult, more uncomfortable truth. I would ask this court not to repeat that same grave injustice here today." Her words carried a weight and emotion that seemed to surprise even her, and she noticed Edmund watching her closely from across the chamber, something complicated and searching in his expression, as though sensing, without fully understanding, the deeper personal significance behind her impassioned defense. The presiding judges conferred quietly for several long, tense minutes, before finally ruling that the matter of the Duke's oversight, while worth noting for future improvements in household governance, did not constitute grounds for formal charges, given the sophisticated and deliberately concealed nature of Lord Ashcombe's scheme. The trial would proceed focused squarely on the conspiracy itself, rather than expanding into unfounded accusations against the ducal household's leadership. Relief swept through the chamber, though Charlotte noticed Edmund's expression remained tense and troubled, even as the immediate threat to his own standing passed. When the court adjourned for the day, he approached her quietly amid the dispersing crowd, his voice low and filled with genuine gratitude. "You saved more than just my household's reputation today," he said. "You saved me from a judgment I had not even realized I was vulnerable to until Ashcombe's lawyers raised it. I do not know how to properly thank you for that." Charlotte studied him carefully, feeling the strange, painful weight of everything unspoken between them. "You do not need to thank me, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I simply could not stand by and watch an innocent person face unjust blame, regardless of who that person might be." Edmund's expression grew thoughtful, searching hers with a new kind of intensity. "You speak as though from painful personal experience once again," he said softly. "I find myself more certain than ever that there is a story behind your fierce convictions that you have not yet fully shared with me." Charlotte held his gaze for a long, quiet moment, understanding that the time for careful half-truths was rapidly drawing to a close. "Perhaps," she said finally, "once this trial has fully concluded and justice has been properly served, it will finally be time to share that story completely." As the trial continued over the following days, evidence mounted steadily and irrefutably against Lord Ashcombe and his co-conspirators. Vivian's careful composure finally crumbled under sustained questioning, and she began offering fragmented admissions in exchange for leniency, admissions that further implicated her father's direct involvement in orchestrating the entire scheme from its earliest beginnings. Gareth Price, faced with overwhelming evidence and Colin Marsh's steady, unwavering testimony, eventually confessed his own role entirely, hoping to receive some measure of mercy by cooperating fully with the court's proceedings. By the trial's final day, the outcome had become all but certain. Lord Bertram Ashcombe stood convicted of orchestrating a scheme to defraud and destabilize the ducal household, his noble title stripped, his estates seized by royal decree, his family's once powerful standing among the noble houses utterly and irreversibly shattered. Vivian, though spared the harshest punishment in exchange for her cooperation, faced permanent exile from court and from the capital entirely. Gareth Price received the full weight of judgment reserved for those who had directly harmed an innocent person in service of greed and betrayal. As the final verdicts were announced and the courtroom finally began to empty, Charlotte watched Edmund closely, seeing the complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease still etched across his features. The conspiracy that had threatened to destroy his household was finally, completely dismantled. Yet something told her, watching the careful weight still resting behind his eyes, that this trial had shaken him more deeply than he yet fully understood, that the brief, unexpected threat to his own standing had given him a small, painful taste of the very injustice she had once suffered so completely, at his own unwitting hands, in another life entirely. That taste, however small and brief, was only the beginning of the reckoning, still waiting patiently ahead. In the days following the trial's conclusion, the capital slowly returned to its ordinary rhythms, though the scandal's aftershocks continued to ripple through noble circles for weeks afterward. Charlotte found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, treated with newfound respect and even quiet admiration among the court officials who had witnessed her steady composure throughout the entire ordeal. Yet amid the relief of justice finally served, she noticed a distinct change in Edmund's demeanor, a quiet withdrawal that troubled her more than she expected. She found him one evening standing alone on a private balcony overlooking the palace gardens, his expression distant and troubled as he gazed out over the darkening grounds. Charlotte approached quietly, uncertain whether to intrude upon his solitude, though something in his posture, the tension held carefully in his shoulders, told her he needed company more than silence tonight. "You have seemed distant since the trial concluded," she said softly, joining him at the balcony railing. "I had expected relief, given how thoroughly justice was served." Edmund was quiet for a long moment before answering, his gaze still fixed on the darkening gardens below. "I keep thinking of that moment during the trial," he said finally, "when Ashcomb's lawyers suggested my own negligence bore responsibility for what happened. For one brief, terrible moment, I understood, with a clarity I had never possessed before, what it might feel like to stand accused of something I did not do, to watch judgment being weighed against me by people who had already decided my guilt before hearing the full truth." Charlotte's heart clenched at his words, understanding the painful irony of what he was describing, a fraction, however small, of exactly what she had endured in her first life, standing on that platform, watching him decide her fate with cold, unmoved certainty. "It is a frightening thing," she said carefully, "to feel the weight of judgment pressing against you, knowing that the truth alone may not be enough to save you, if those in power choose not to look closely enough to see it." Edmund turned to face her fully, something raw and searching in his expression. "I have begun to wonder, Charlotte, how many times in my own family's history, judgment has been passed too quickly, too harshly, without proper consideration of the full truth. My father ruled with an iron certainty that trust was a weakness, that mercy invited betrayal. I have followed that same philosophy without question, for most of my life, believing it simply the necessary cost of holding power responsibly. And now?" Charlotte asked quietly, her pulse quickening with cautious hope. "Now," Edmund said slowly, "I find myself questioning whether that philosophy has cost this household more than it has ever protected. I wonder how many decisions, made with that same cold certainty, might have been terrible mistakes, judgments passed too swiftly against people who perhaps deserved far more consideration than they ever received." Charlotte felt her breath catch, the weight of everything she still had not told him pressing urgently against her chest. She understood, with sudden clarity, that this moment, standing quietly together on this darkened balcony, might be the closest she would ever come to a natural opening for the truth she had carried so carefully for years. "Edmund," she said softly, using his given name for the first time, feeling the intimacy of it settle between them like something fragile and significant. "If you discovered that a judgment your family once made, a judgment made with that same cold certainty you describe, had in fact been a terrible mistake, one that cost an innocent person everything, what would you do?" Edmund studied her closely, something shifting behind his careful expression, as though sensing the deeper weight hidden within her seemingly hypothetical question. "I would want to know the full truth," he said slowly, "no matter how difficult or painful it proved to hear. I would want the chance to understand what I had done wrong, and if possible, to make whatever amends still remained within my power. Charlotte held his gaze for a long, trembling moment, feeling the truth rising within her chest, like a tide she could no longer hold back entirely. But even as the words gathered on her lips, a sudden commotion from within the palace interrupted the fragile moment. A servant rushing onto the balcony with urgent news that required Edmund's immediate attention regarding the final disposition of the Ashcombe estates. The moment passed, the truth once again delayed, though Charlotte understood, with a quiet, steady certainty, that it could not remain hidden much longer. Edmund's growing willingness to question his family's cold philosophy, his genuine desire to understand the truth, even when it proved painful, told her that the time for full honesty was rapidly approaching, whether she felt fully prepared for it or not. As she made her way home that evening, Charlotte found herself reflecting on how far both of them had traveled since that first execution she remembered so painfully, since the cold, unmoved face that had once watched her die without a single word in her defense. The man beside her tonight bore little resemblance to that memory, and yet she understood, with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had already lost everything once before, that true character was rarely revealed in comfortable moments. It was revealed in the crucible of difficult truths, and soon, Edmund would face the most difficult truth of all, the truth of who she truly was, and what role his own past judgment had played in a story he did not yet remember living at all. The full truth finally emerged on a quiet evening, nearly 2 weeks after that interrupted conversation on the balcony, when Edmund arrived unannounced at the Harbor House, requesting a private audience, with an urgency that told Charlotte immediately that something significant had prompted his visit. Her father, sensing the gravity of the moment, quietly excused himself to give them privacy in the small sitting room, leaving Charlotte alone with the man whose judgment had once ended her life so completely. "I spoke with Colin Marsh again yesterday," Edmund said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her, his expression carrying a mixture of confusion and dawning realization that made Charlotte's heart pound with sudden apprehension. "He told me of a conversation you shared with him, some months ago, about a young advisor who once served this household, who was executed swiftly for treason before the truth could be properly examined. He said you asked her name, though the conversation was interrupted before he could answer." Charlotte felt the color drain from her face, understanding that the moment she had carefully delayed for so long had finally arrived, whether she felt ready for it or not. "I made some inquiries of my own," Edmund continued, his voice low and careful. "I found old court records, nearly buried and forgotten, describing the execution of a woman named Charlotte Hale, accused of selling trade secrets to a rival province, executed on the order of my own father, nearly 9 years before I was even born." Charlotte's breath caught sharply. She had not considered, in all her careful planning, that the timeline of her second life might not align perfectly with her first. That this execution he described might have happened to a different Charlotte Hale entirely. Someone from a generation before her own birth in this new timeline. Someone whose fate she now realized she must have somehow inherited, or perhaps, more strangely and impossibly, been reborn as through some twist of fate she did not fully understand herself. "The records were sparse," Edmund continued, watching her closely, "but they mentioned a Duke Cole presiding over her execution, my own father, decades before my birth. I confess, I do not fully understand why this discovery has troubled me so deeply, except that something about the name, about the circumstances, feels impossibly connected to you, though I cannot explain why or how." Charlotte closed her eyes for a long moment, understanding that the truth she had carried so carefully, so painfully, could no longer remain hidden, regardless of how impossible or unbelievable it might sound. She had spent months preparing for this moment, yet now that it had finally arrived, she found the words more difficult to summon than she had ever anticipated. "Edmund," she said softly, opening her eyes to meet his searching gaze directly, "what I am about to tell you will sound impossible. I ask only that you listen fully before you decide whether to believe me." He nodded slowly, his expression tense with anticipation. "The Charlotte Hale executed in those records," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed, "was me. Not an ancestor, not a coincidence of shared names across generations, but truly, impossibly, myself. I lived that life, served your family faithfully as an advisor, fell in love with a man I trusted completely, only to be falsely accused of treason and executed on his direct order, without him ever pausing to question the evidence against me. Edmund stared at her, his expression a complicated mixture of confusion, disbelief, and something else. Something that looked almost like dawning, horrified recognition. "That is not possible," he said slowly, though his voice lacked full conviction, even as he spoke the words. "The records show that execution took place decades before either of us were born in this timeline." "I know it defies all reasonable explanation," Charlotte said, "and I have asked myself countless times how such a thing could be possible. But I remember it all, Edmund, every detail, every moment, as clearly as if it happened only days ago rather than in some other life entirely. I remember standing on that platform, looking up at the man who once claimed to trust me completely, watching him decide my fate with the same cold, unmoved certainty his father had likely once shown him. I remember the crowd, the silence, the blade, and I remember waking afterward in this life, given some strange, impossible second chance to prevent the same tragedy from claiming another innocent life." Edmund's hands trembled slightly as he absorbed her words, his careful composure finally cracking entirely beneath the weight of what she was describing. "You believe I was that man," he said quietly. "You believe I ordered your execution in some other life, some other version of events that somehow led you back here, to me, in this one." "I do not simply believe it," Charlotte said softly, tears finally beginning to gather in her eyes, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I know it, Edmund, with a certainty that has shaped every single decision I have made since waking in this second life. I built my quiet path away from court, specifically to avoid the same fate. I investigated this conspiracy so relentlessly, in part, because I recognized the same patterns of betrayal that once destroyed me. And when you asked me, weeks ago, what you would do if you discovered a judgment your family once made had been a terrible mistake, I nearly told you the truth then. Because that judgment, Edmund, was the one that ended my life, made by a man who wore your very face." Edmund rose abruptly, pacing the small sitting room with visible agitation, his mind clearly racing to reconcile the impossible truth she had just revealed with everything he understood about the world. "If this is true," he said finally, turning back to face her, his voice thick with emotion, "then I owe you a debt I cannot possibly repay. I let you die once, trusted false evidence over the truth of someone who loved me, and gave you no chance to prove your innocence before ending your life entirely." "You did," Charlotte said quietly, unable to soften the painful truth, despite the raw grief now visible in his expression. "Though I understand now that it was not truly you, not this version of you, shaped by different circumstances and choices, in this second chance we have both somehow been given. I do not hold you responsible for a crime you have not yet committed, and perhaps, given how much you have grown these past months, never will commit at all." Edmund knelt slowly before her chair, his expression stricken with a grief and remorse so raw and genuine that Charlotte felt her own carefully guarded heart finally begin to crack open completely. "I cannot undo what happened, in whatever life you remember," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I swear to you now, Charlotte, that I will spend whatever time remains in this life, proving myself worthy of the trust you have shown me, worthy of the second chance fate has somehow given us both." Charlotte reached out, gently touching his face, feeling the warmth of genuine connection, finally breaking through years of careful, guarded distance. "That is all I have ever hoped for," she said softly, tears finally falling freely down her cheeks. "Though I confess, I never truly believed, until this very moment, that such a thing might actually be possible." Together, in the quiet sitting room of her father's harbor house, two people bound by an impossible tragedy from another life finally began, cautiously and completely, to build something new between them, something built not on blind trust given too easily, but on truth, finally spoken aloud, understood, and accepted in its entirety. They sat together for hours that evening, long after the initial shock of her revelation had settled into something quieter and more contemplative, as Charlotte finally allowed herself to share the fuller details of the life she remembered, the years she had spent serving faithfully as his advisor, the small moments of genuine connection they had shared before betrayal tore everything apart, the friendships that had crumbled the moment accusations began to spread through the court like poison through water. "I remember loving you," she admitted quietly, watching his expression carefully as she spoke the vulnerable truth. Not simply the version of you sitting here now, but the man I knew then, before circumstances hardened him into someone capable of watching me die without protest. I have spent this second life trying to understand what led him to that coldness, wondering whether it was simply his nature, or whether it was something taught, something inherited from a father who believed mercy was nothing more than weakness, dressed in kinder clothing. Edmund listened with quiet, focused attention, absorbing every word with the gravity it deserved. My father's philosophy has shaped me more deeply than I ever fully realized, he admitted. I have spent my entire life believing that trust freely given was simply an invitation for betrayal, that a ruler who showed mercy too easily would soon find himself surrounded by those eager to exploit that weakness. I see now how easily that philosophy could curdle into something far more dangerous, a willingness to believe the worst of someone without ever pausing to seek the full truth. It is not too late to choose differently, Charlotte said softly. You have already shown, throughout this entire conspiracy, a willingness to question, to seek truth carefully, rather than rushing toward convenient judgment. That capacity was always within you, Edmund. It simply required the right circumstances, and perhaps the right person, to help bring it fully into the light. Edmund reached for her hand, holding it gently, as though afraid too firm a grip might somehow shatter the fragile trust growing so carefully between them. I want to be that different man for you, he said quietly, not simply because I owe you an impossible debt from another life, but because these past months, getting to know you, watching your courage and clarity throughout this entire ordeal, I have come to care for you more deeply than I have ever cared for anyone else in my life. Charlotte felt her heart swell with a warmth she had not allowed herself to fully embrace until this very moment, the cautious hope she had carried quietly for months, finally blossoming into something she no longer felt the need to guard so carefully. I have come to care for you as well, she admitted softly, though I confess, it frightened me deeply to feel that warmth growing again. Given everything I once lost, to a version of you, I could not yet be certain you had truly moved beyond. And now? Edmund asked, his voice carrying a vulnerable hope she had never heard from him before, not even in the earliest days of their first life together. Now, Charlotte said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her careful composure. I believe, for the first time since I woke in this second life, that perhaps fate did not simply give me a second chance to prevent a tragedy from repeating itself. Perhaps it gave me a second chance to build something better than what was lost, something built on truth and understanding, rather than blind trust and convenient judgment. They talked long into the night, Edmund asking careful, thoughtful questions about the life she remembered, wanting to understand every detail of what had gone wrong before, determined to ensure that whatever future they built together would never again fall into the same patterns of suspicion and betrayal that had once cost her everything. Charlotte found herself, for the first time since her execution in that other life, finally able to set down the heavy weight of secrecy she had carried alone for so long, sharing openly with someone who listened, not with skepticism or dismissal, but with genuine remorse and a fierce determination to do better. Before he finally took his leave that night, Edmund paused at the door, turning back to face her with an expression of quiet, resolute determination. I intend to speak with my mother about everything you have shared with me, he said. Not the full details of your first life, perhaps, as I suspect that truth might prove too difficult for others to accept as readily as I have come to accept it. But I want her to understand fully the depth of your courage and character, and I want the household to formally recognize the debt we owe you for everything you have done to protect us from Lord Ashcombe's conspiracy. You do not need to repay any debt, Charlotte said softly. I did not undertake this investigation for reward, Edmund. I did it because I could not bear to watch history repeat its cruelest patterns, without at least attempting to prevent it. I understand that, Edmund said, and it is precisely why I believe you deserve recognition, not as repayment for a debt that can never truly be settled, but as acknowledgement of the remarkable person you have proven yourself to be, in this life, and, I now understand, in the one before it as well. As he finally departed into the quiet night, Charlotte remained standing at her window for a long while, watching his carriage disappear down the narrow harbor street, feeling a lightness in her chest she had not experienced in longer than she could clearly remember, a sense that perhaps, at long last, the heaviest burdens of her impossible second life had finally begun to lift. Yet even amid that quiet, hopeful joy, Charlotte understood that true healing, true trust, rebuilt between two people bound by such a painful shared history, would require far more than a single evening's honest conversation. It would require patience, continued effort, and a willingness from both of them to face whatever challenges still lay ahead, with the same courage and clarity that had brought them safely through the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed them both. But for tonight, standing quietly at her window beneath a sky full of distant stars, Charlotte allowed herself simply to feel grateful for the impossible second chance she had been given, and for the man who had finally, truly, begun to prove himself worthy of it. Spring arrived in the capital nearly 6 months after the trial's conclusion, bringing with it a sense of renewal that mirrored the quiet transformation both Charlotte and Edmund had undergone throughout the difficult months preceding it. The harbor city bloomed with color along its winding streets, merchant stalls overflowing with fresh goods after the long winter, and Charlotte found herself, more often than not, dividing her time between her father's thriving shipping business and increasingly frequent visits to the palace, where her counsel had become genuinely valued, rather than simply tolerated. Duchess Agatha had welcomed the news of her son's growing affection for Charlotte with far more warmth than either of them had initially expected. "I have watched you these past months, Miss Hale," the Duchess told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the palace gardens, "and I have come to believe that whatever unusual circumstances brought you into our lives, they have proven a genuine blessing, rather than the danger I might once have feared from an unknown outsider gaining such influence over my son. He has grown wiser, more thoughtful, more willing to seek truth carefully rather than rushing toward convenient judgment. I credit much of that growth to your steady influence." Charlotte had not shared the full truth of her first life with the Duchess, understanding that some truths remained too impossible, too painful, for others to fully accept, even those who had come to trust her judgment completely. But she found comfort in knowing that Edmund understood the complete truth, that the burden she had carried alone for so long was no longer hers to bear in solitude. Colin Marsh, having fully recovered from his injuries, had been formally honored by the Duchess for his courage in exposing the conspiracy, and he had taken to visiting Charlotte and her father regularly, forming an unlikely friendship built on shared history and mutual respect. "I still wonder sometimes," he told her one afternoon, as they shared tea in her father's sitting room, "about that first Charlotte Hale I mentioned so long ago, the one executed decades before you were born. I never did learn the full story of what happened to her." Charlotte smiled softly, understanding the strange, private irony of his words. "Perhaps," she said gently, "some stories are simply meant to remain a mystery, Master Marsh, their true meaning understood only by those fortunate enough to receive a second chance to make things right." Henry, too, remained a steady and cherished presence throughout this new chapter of her life, his friendship never wavering despite the significant changes in her circumstances. He had expanded his own trading business considerably in the wake of Lord Ashcombe's downfall, absorbing several of the smaller contracts that had once belonged to the disgraced noble family, and he often joked that Charlotte's fierce investigation had proven rather good for business, even if it had also nearly cost them both their lives along the way. "I always knew you were destined for something greater than counting coins in a harbor warehouse," Henry told her one evening, as they celebrated the formal announcement of her father's newly expanded trading partnership with several northern provinces, an arrangement made possible by the restored trust following Lord Ashcombe's exposure. "Though I confess, I never imagined it would involve uncovering conspiracies and standing before the entire royal court." "Neither did I," Charlotte admitted, laughing softly at the memory of how far she had traveled since that terrifying morning. She had first awakened in this second life, uncertain and frightened, determined only to avoid the fate that had once destroyed her completely. It was on a warm evening in early summer, nearly a year after Charlotte had first been summoned to the palace to present her initial findings on the northern trade conspiracy, that Edmund invited her to walk with him through the same palace gardens where his mother had once offered her such genuine warmth and acceptance. The gardens were in full bloom, fragrant with roses and evening jasmine, the setting sun casting a soft golden light across the carefully tended paths. "I have thought a great deal these past months," Edmund said, as they walked slowly together beneath the flowering arbors, "about the kind of duke I wish to become, and the kind of life I wish to build, now that I understand more fully the terrible cost of judgment passed too quickly, of trust withheld too fearfully. "You have already become someone quite different from the man I once knew in that other life," Charlotte said softly, reaching for his hand as they walked. "I see it in every decision you have made since the trial concluded, in every careful, patient choice to seek truth before passing judgment." Edmund stopped walking, turning to face her fully beneath the fragrant blossoms, his expression carrying a nervous vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from him, even during their most difficult conversations. "I do not wish simply to be different from that man," he said quietly. "I wish to build an entirely new future, one worthy of the extraordinary second chance we have both somehow been given. Charlotte, I love you, not simply because of some debt I owe you from a tragedy I do not fully remember living, but because of who you have proven yourself to be, throughout every single moment I have witnessed, since we first properly met in this life." He knelt slowly before her, drawing a small velvet box from within his coat, and Charlotte felt her breath catch entirely, tears already gathering in her eyes before he had even finished speaking. "I understand," he continued, his voice steady, despite the obvious emotion behind his words, "that trust, once broken so completely, cannot simply be rebuilt through words alone. I understand that you have every right to remain cautious, given everything you have already suffered. But I am asking you, with everything within me, to allow me the chance to spend the rest of this life proving myself worthy of your trust, day after day, for as long as you will allow it. Charlotte Hale, will you marry me, and help me build the kind of future neither of us ever truly believed possible?" Charlotte stared down at him, this man who had once, in another life entirely, watched her die without a single word of protest, now kneeling before her with genuine humility and love, offering her a future built on truth and understanding, rather than blind trust and careless judgment. She thought of the platform, the crowd, the cold indifference that had once ended everything she cherished. She thought of waking in this second life, frightened and uncertain, vowing never again to walk blindly into danger. She thought of every careful step that had led her back to this moment, this man, this fragile and precious second chance. "Yes," she said softly, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, as joy and relief, and hard-won hope, all mingled together within her chest. "Yes, Edmund, I will marry you, and I will help you build whatever future we choose together, one built on the truth we have both fought so hard to uncover and protect." Edmund rose swiftly, gathering her into an embrace filled with genuine warmth and relief, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke, simply standing together beneath the fragrant blossoms as the last golden light of evening faded gently into the soft blue of twilight. Their wedding took place that autumn, a celebration attended by merchants and nobles alike, a rare gathering that symbolized the very unity Charlotte had once believed impossible between the two worlds she had navigated so carefully throughout her extraordinary second life. Her father wept openly with joy as he walked her down the flower-lined aisle, and Henry stood proudly among the honored guests, raising his cup in a warm, teasing toast to the woman who had once claimed she found lords entirely uninteresting. Duchess Agatha embraced her warmly as a true daughter following the ceremony, and Colin Marsh, now serving as one of Edmund's most trusted senior advisors, offered a quiet, knowing smile that suggested he understood, perhaps, more of the truth behind Charlotte's remarkable journey than he had ever openly admitted. In the years that followed, Charlotte and Edmund ruled their household together, with a wisdom and fairness that became widely admired throughout the kingdom. Their partnership built on the hard-won understanding that true strength lay not in cold suspicion or unquestioning trust, but in the careful, patient pursuit of truth, and in the courage to face even the most difficult realities honestly, together, rather than alone. Charlotte never forgot the painful lessons of her first life, the platform, the crowd, the cold indifference that had once ended everything she cherished. But she carried those memories now, not as a wound that continued to bleed, but as a hard-won wisdom that had ultimately led her towards something far more precious than the trust she had once lost so completely. She had been given an impossible second chance, and rather than simply preventing the tragedy that had once destroyed her, she had built something entirely new upon its ashes, a life defined not by fear or suspicion, but by truth, courage, and a love finally strong enough to survive even the harshest tests fate could offer. And somewhere within the quiet corridors of the palace she now called home, in the gentle warmth of Edmund's steady gaze whenever their eyes met across a crowded room, Charlotte understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that this second life, however impossible its beginning, had finally become everything she had once dared only to hope for in her darkest, most desperate moments. The cruel duke who had once executed her without hesitation was gone entirely, replaced by a man who had learned, through genuine suffering and hard-won understanding, the true and lasting value of trust freely given, truth carefully sought, and love finally, fully earned.